Imagine yourself living in the heart of medieval Europe, perhaps in a small stone village or within the wooden walls of a bustling market town. The air smells faintly of smoke from the hearths, and you hear the distant toll of a church bell, calling the faithful to prayer. Life here is ruled by two forces that seem absolute: the church and tradition. For a woman, these forces do not just shape the rhythm of daily life. They dictate how she is allowed to feel, behave, and even think about her own desires. Medieval society was built upon rigid hierarchies and expectations. At the top were kings, lords, and the clergy, while peasants and laborers made up the majority of the population. But even within these layers, women had their own distinct set of rules, to follow rules that were often invisible, but deeply felt. A woman's body was considered not her own. It was seen as a vessel of honor for her family, a symbol of virtue, or a potential source of sin, depending on who was looking. From birth, a girl's life was mapped out. Her future would most likely involve marriage, arranged not out of affection, but for alliances, property, or survival. Romantic love, as we imagine it today, was rarely the foundation of marriage. Instead, the union of a man and woman was a social contract. The church often described women as needing guidance, painting them as more likely to succumb to temptation. This attitude seeped into laws, customs, and everyday life. For a woman to show any sign of personal enjoyment or attraction outside the expectations of her husband or, even before marriage, was dangerous. Gossip spread quickly, and a reputation was everything. A single rumor could destroy a young woman's chances of marrying, which often meant the difference between a stable life and one of poverty. Villagers whispered about behavior that did not seem proper, and women were expected to behave modestly, speak softly, and avoid any hint of boldness in how they dressed or acted. The church played a powerful role in defining what was considered virtue. Religious teachings told women that they should remain pure before marriage and be entirely devoted to their husband afterward. Women were frequently reminded that the first woman, Eve, had brought sin into the world through temptation. This story was used as a warning. Women were considered capable of leading men astray and, therefore, needed to be carefully controlled. Even simple things like laughter in the wrong setting, dancing, or enjoying a conversation with an unmarried man could be Medieval law codes also reflected this mindset. In many regions, a woman's worth was legally tied to her chastity. If she was accused of misconduct, her testimony might be dismissed simply because she was seen as less trustworthy than men. Punishments for women accused of improper behavior could be severe. While men might face fines or temporary shame, women could be ostracized, beaten, or forced into humiliating public confessions. Of course, not every woman lived under the same conditions. The rules varied depending on where you were in Europe and whether you were a peasant, a merchant's daughter, or a noble woman. Wealthier women had more material comfort, but they were still subject to intense scrutiny. A noblewoman's marriage was often arranged to strengthen political ties, and her behavior was expected to reflect the honor of her entire family. If she dared to defy these expectations, the consequences could ripple far beyond her own life. One of the strangest aspects of medieval thought about women was how natural desires were seen as something shameful or dangerous. Medical texts of the time, written mostly by men, often described women as having uncontrollable passions that needed to be subdued. These texts mix superstition with flawed understanding of the human body, suggesting that women were naturally weaker, both physically and morally. Doctors and clerics warned that women who were too independent or too forward were a threat to social order. This constant policing of behavior created a culture of fear and silence. Many women likely felt torn between their natural feelings and the demands of a society that viewed those feelings with suspicion. Even within marriage, where desire was technically allowed, women were expected to prioritize their husband's needs above their own. It wasn't about love or connection as much as fulfilling a duty. But history is never as simple as the rules written in books or preached in churches. Beneath the surface, women found ways to express themselves and to live fuller lives than the strict codes suggested. Some women used subtle forms of resistance, choosing when to smile, when to flirt, or when to speak their mind, even if it risked a raised eyebrow. In towns and villages, there were always stories of women who did entirely follow the script. A merchant's wife who quietly conducted her own trade, or a widow who managed her property with confidence despite the murmurs of neighbors. There were also the courtesans and entertainers who, while living on the fringes of respectability, wielded a certain kind of power. Though society judged them harshly, they were often better educated, more worldly, and more financially independent than many noblewomen. Their lives were a paradox, condemned in public, yet privately admired or sought after by powerful men. The medieval idea of rules for women was not just about morality, it was about control. By dictating how women should act and think, the ruling classes and the church maintained order. A woman who was quiet, obedient, and modest was less likely to challenge authority. Yet, even in this world of constraints, women's voices and experiences cannot be entirely erased. Through letters, poems, and stories passed down through generations, we catch glimpses of women who felt deeply, who loved, and who lived complex lives despite the limits placed on them. Imagine, for a moment, being one of those women. You walk through the marketplace, your head covered by a simple veil. You keep your eyes lowered, not because you lack curiosity, but because a wandering gaze might be noticed. A passing conversation might turn to who you are, where you come from, and whether you are good or proper. Even when you are silent, people form opinions. In such a world, even small acts like singing while you work, or choosing a brighter color for your dress carry meaning. As we dive deeper into this history, the question becomes clear. How much of what we know about women's lives in the Middle Ages is shaped by the voices of men who wrote the laws, sermons, and chronicles? How many stories of women's courage, humor, and quiet defiance have been lost because they were not considered worth recording? And most importantly, what did it truly feel like to be a woman living under these invisible rules, constantly balancing between being seen as virtuous and being judged as improper? The expectations placed on medieval women were not just enforced by religious leaders and lawmakers, but were woven into the very fabric of everyday life. From the moment a girl was born, her future was largely predetermined. Her education, if she had one at all, revolved around domestic duties and moral instruction. A noble girl might be taught to embroider, read religious texts, or manage household accounts, while a peasant girl would learn to cook over a smoky fire, tend animals, and spin wool. Very little of this education encouraged her to understand or embrace her own feelings. Instead, the focus was on obedience, humility, and service. Marriage and control. Marriage was seen as the central point of a woman's existence. A young woman was expected to marry as soon as she reached an age deemed suitable by her family, which could be as early as 12 or 13 among the nobility. Marriages were arranged by families, often without the girl's consent. Her role was not to find love or happiness, but to secure alliances or wealth for her kin. In this environment, the concept of personal attraction or pleasure was rarely considered important. Once married, a woman's identity was often swallowed by that of her husband. In legal terms, many medieval cultures considered a wife to be part of her husband's property. Her ability to own land, control money, or make decisions was heavily restricted. While widows sometimes regained a measure of independence, they were still scrutinized for their choices, especially if they decided to remarry. The church reinforced these expectations by teaching that a woman's role was to obey her husband as if he were her spiritual guardian. Priests often spoke of the wife's duty in marriage, framing intimacy as something that was less about connection and more about fulfilling obligations. The concept of a woman openly enjoying intimacy or pursuing her own desires was viewed as scandalous and even sinful. Gossip and reputation in a close-knit medieval community. Gossip was powerful. A single careless remark could mark a woman as improper or wild, labels that were difficult to shake. If a woman laughed too loudly in public, spoke with confidence, or seemed friendly with a man who wasn't her husband, whispers would start. These rumors weren't just idle talk. They could lead to real consequences, such as being shunned by neighbors or accused of immorality. The weight of reputation meant that women were constantly aware of how they presented themselves. Clothing was carefully chosen to avoid appearing too bold. A simple ribbon in the hair, a flash of bright fabric, or a confident stride could invite unwanted attention. For noble women, the stakes were even higher. Their every action was observed and judged, not only by their immediate family, but by entire courts of attendants and advisors. The church's teachings on women's desire. The medieval church had a complex and often contradictory stance on women's feelings and body. On one hand, religious texts celebrated the Virgin Mary as the ultimate example of purity and virtue. On the other, they viewed ordinary women as deeply flawed, easily tempted, and responsible for leading men into sin. Sermons often reminded congregations of Eve's role in the fall of man, suggesting that women were inherently dangerous if not controlled. Religious scholars debated how women should behave, with some even writing detailed guides on how to manage a wife as supposed unruly emotions. Confession became a tool for control, as women were encouraged to disclose even their private thoughts to priests. Through confession, the church learned of the personal struggles and desires that women faced, and these confessions often reinforced the notion that such feelings were shameful. Interestingly, some medieval medical theories suggested that women were naturally more passionate than men, which was seen as a weakness. These beliefs were often based on ancient texts by Greek and Roman physicians, which were misinterpreted and combined with Christian teachings. As a result, the natural emotional and physical needs of women were treated as something to suppress, not understand. The double standard it is. Important to remember that the rules around women's conduct were not applied equally to men. A man's reputation could withstand far more scandal than a woman's, while women were punished or shamed for any perceived impropriety. Men who engaged in questionable behavior often faced little consequence. In some cases, a man's wildness was even celebrated as a sign of strength or virility. This double standard made life especially difficult for women who wanted to live authentically or express themselves. For women of the lower classes, survival often required bending these rules. A peasant wife might take on roles traditionally reserved for men, such as managing farm work or negotiating at markets, simply because it was necessary. While these women were less scrutinized than noble women, they still risked being judged if they appeared too independent or assertive. The quiet resistance of women. Despite the heavy weight of social expectations, women found small ways to resist and assert their individuality. Some turned to writing or storytelling, passing down tales that reflected their experiences and hopes. Others formed close-knit groups with other women, sharing wisdom and providing emotional support. Folk songs, household recipes, and herbal remedies were often handed down through generations of women, becoming subtle acts of independence and knowledge. There were also women who defied societal norms entirely. Some joined religious orders not out of devotion but to escape marriage and gain a degree of autonomy. In convents, women could become educated, manage property, and even write. While nuns were still under the authority of the church, they often enjoyed more intellectual and personal freedom than many of their married counterparts. Then there were the traveling women, those who became midwives, healers, or merchants. These women walked a fine line between respect and suspicion. Their knowledge of herbs and healing sometimes brought them wealth and admiration, but it also made them targets during times of fear or superstition, as accusations of witchcraft were never far behind. The fear of being misunderstood in this world of unspoken rules and silent judgments. The fear of being misunderstood shaped how women lived. Even the simplest actions were scrutinized. If a woman smiled at a stranger, was it an act of kindness, or was she being too forward? If she chose not to marry, was she pious or suspiciously strange? These questions were not just idle speculation. They could determine a woman's future. The line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior was real. A noble woman might be praised for her beauty and grace one day, and condemned for being too proud the next. A peasant woman might be admired for her hard work, but scorned if she seemed too independent. It was an exhausting cycle of appearances, expectations, and unspoken fears. Even within the safety of their homes, women were reminded of their roles. Household manuals and religious texts emphasized obedience, quietness, and to desire more, to seek affection, joy, or personal fulfillment was often seen as selfish or even sinful. An unresolved question yet. For all the strict rules and whispered warnings, history shows us that women were never simply passive. They lived, loved, and found ways to leave their mark, even if their stories were rarely recorded. As we look back on this period, we are left to wonder, how many women quietly defied these rules, living lives of hidden courage that we will never fully know? As the Victorian era moved toward its final decades, the growing understanding of public health and sanitation began to reshape not only the lives of ordinary people, but also the practices within royal households. Queen Victoria's reign coincided with a time of tremendous transformation in how society viewed cleanliness, disease, and the responsibilities of the state toward its citizens. What had once been seen as personal habits, or luxuries such as regular bathing or clean water, were becoming recognized as essential for health and longevity. For a monarch who presided over the height of the British Empire, these shifts were as significant as any political reform. In the early part of her reign, outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases were common in Britain's industrial cities. Contaminated drinking water and the lack of proper sewage systems made urban life hazardous. For the working poor, hygiene was often a matter of survival. While Queen Victoria may have been sheltered from these dangers, she and Prince Albert were deeply concerned about the health crises facing their people. Albert, with his forward-thinking approach, saw the connection between sanitation and public welfare. His support for the installation of modern sewage and drainage systems, as well as his endorsement of cleaner public spaces, helped lay the foundation for the sweeping reforms that would follow. The Great Stink of 1858 in London was a turning point. During a particularly hot summer, the River Thames, which ran through the city, emitted such a foul odor due to untreated sewage that it became unbearable even for those in the halls of Parliament. The stench was not merely unpleasant, it was believed to carry disease. This event prompted serious action, leading to the construction of a comprehensive sewage system designed by engineer Joseph Bazan. Though this project was more about public infrastructure than personal hygiene, it reflected a changing attitude toward cleanliness that would eventually reach all levels of society, including the royal family. Queen Victoria's personal hygiene routines began to evolve alongside these public reforms. As indoor plumbing became more sophisticated, bathing became easier and less tight. By the 1870s and 1880s, the royal residences boasted bathrooms with running water and improved drainage systems, making the process of bathing far more convenient. It is likely that, in her later years, Victoria bathed more frequently than she had in her youth, though she still retained many of the old habits, such as relying on floral waters and perfumes. Perfume and scent continued to play a major role in Victorian cleanliness rituals. For the Queen, subtle fragrances like rose, violet, and elderflower were favorites. Unlike the strong, musky perfumes of earlier centuries, Victorian scents were lighter and designed to evoke freshness and refinement. This preference for gentle fragrances symbolized a shift in the concept of hygiene from simply masking odors to creating an impression of purity and grace. Tooth care also improved during this time. Toothbrushes with better bristles and new tooth powders became more common. The wealthy had access to imported dental tools and treatments, though they were still rudimentary compared to modern standards. Queen Victoria's personal dental care likely reflected the best practices available in her time. Yet even these would seem crude today. Another aspect of hygiene that evolved was laundry. Advances in fabric care and the use of new detergents meant that clothing could be washed more effectively. For the Queen's household, the sheer volume of clothing was staggering, with multiple outfits required each day for various events and duties. A team of laundresses worked constantly to clean undergarments, linens, and personal items. Outer gowns, which were expensive and delicate, were still only spot clean, but the frequency of laundering underclothes increased as awareness of cleanliness grew, as the Victorian public became more aware of germ theories. Especially after the work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, personal hygiene took on a new dimension. Lister's promotion of antiseptic techniques in surgery revolutionized medicine and reinforced the importance of cleanliness. Even though Queen Victoria's early habits had been shaped by old-fashioned beliefs, she lived long enough to witness this transformation. By the time she celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, daily bathing and frequent hand-washing were becoming more widely accepted among the upper classes. Yet, despite all these changes, there was still a strong sense of ritual and formality in Victorian hygiene. For the Queen, bathing or grooming was not just about physical cleanliness, but also about maintaining the image of a disciplined and respectable monarch. Every detail of her appearance, her hair, her gloves, the subtle fragrance of her floral waters was part of the carefully constructed image that defined her rule. Reflecting on this now, it is fascinating to see how much the concept of hygiene has evolved. Today, we associate cleanliness with health, convenience, and efficiency. We can turn a tap and have hot water in seconds, wash clothes in machines, and choose from hundreds of soaps and shampoos. In contrast, the Victorian idea of hygiene was slower, more labor-intensive, and often focused on appearance rather than deep cleaning. It's not that they didn't value being clean, they simply understood it differently. When you think of Queen Victoria's daily life, with her servants preparing scented cloths, and her hair being brushed for an hour at night, it's easy to wonder how she would have reacted to the speed of modern hygiene routines. Would she have found them too rushed, too mechanical, lacking the sense of ritual that defined her era? Or would she have marveled at the simplicity and comfort of a world where even the average person can enjoy a warm shower every day? In her later years, Victoria's hygiene routines likely became even simpler as age and health issues made elaborate baths less practical. She continued to rely on her attendants for much of her personal care, but the availability of better plumbing and improved products would have made the process easier. When she died in 1901, she left behind not just an empire, but also a legacy of cultural habits that would slowly give way to modern notions of cleanliness in the Edwardian era and beyond. The story of Queen Victoria's hygiene is more than just an odd historical detail. As a window into a time when the world was transitioning from old ways to new. It shows how something as simple as bathing can reflect larger changes in science, society, and even politics. In a way, the shift from rosewater cloths and perfumes to hot baths and germ-fighting soaps mirrors the Victorian journey from tradition to progress. So, as you imagine the Queen seated in her chambers, surrounded by polished silver, heavy drapes, and the faint scent of rose water, it is worth asking yourself, how much of what we consider essential in our hygiene routines will seem outdated a century from now? Will people in the future look back at us with the same mix of curiosity and amusement with which we now view Queen Victoria's rituals? In the quiet stone chapels and wooden confession booths of medieval Europe, a world of whispered fears and forbidden secrets unfolded. For many women, confession was not simply a spiritual duty, it was a deeply personal ritual, a place where the weight of expectations and unspoken rules pressed heavily on their shoulders. The church taught that salvation required purity and the admission of sins, yet what was considered sinful often overlapped with the most private and human aspects of a woman's life. Imagine standing in line for confession, your head covered with a simple veil, feeling the chill of the stone floor beneath your feet. The air is heavy, with a scent of candle wax and incense. Behind you, other villagers wait in silence, each holding their own small burdens of guilt or fear. When your turn comes, you step inside the wooden booth, where the priest's voice is calm but distant. He asks you to reveal your thoughts, your actions, and your doubts, things you may never have spoken aloud before. For women, these confessions often revolved around the smallest of matters, because even a modest expression of independence or curiosity could be viewed as suspect. The church's teachings about women Yes, behavior were rooted in the belief that women were inherently fragile and more likely to fall into temptation. This idea, passed down from biblical stories like that of Eve, painted women as both vulnerable and dangerous. As a result, a woman's thoughts about love, attraction, or even a fleeting moment of joy could feel like a heavy secret to be purged through confession. There was a quiet fear that failing to confess such thoughts might not only harm the soul, but also bring shame to the family and community. Confession was meant to bring forgiveness, but for some women, it was also a tool of surveillance. Through these private conversations, priests gained insight into their lives, their fears, and their private struggles. This knowledge reinforced the power of the church and its ability to shape how women behave. A woman might leave the booth feeling lighter, but also more aware of the invisible boundaries that defined her life. Beyond confession, the punishments for women accused of improper behavior were severe and public. If a woman was accused of stepping outside the expectations of virtue, her life could unravel quickly. Gossip was often the first weapon. A neighbor's careless words, a merchant's suspicious glance, or even the envy of another woman could spark whispers that spread like wildfire. Once a rumor took hold, proving innocence was almost impossible. In many medieval towns, public shaming was used as a way to reinforce social order. A woman accused of disobedience or impropriety could be made to stand in the town square, wearing a sign of her supposed misdeeds, or subjected to verbal insults from her neighbors. In some cases, women were paraded through the streets, their hair cut short as a symbol of disgrace. Though these punishments might not always involve physical harm, the humiliation could be devastating. There were also legal consequences. Laws regarding women's behavior varied from region to region, but they often treated women far more harshly than men. In some cases, a woman accused of adultery could face fines, imprisonment, or worse, while a male counterpart might escape with little more than a warning. These double standards reinforced the idea that women were the moral backbone of society. Any misstep on their part was seen as a greater threat to the community's stability. Yet behind the strict rules and harsh punishments, women carried secrets that history rarely records. Many of these secrets were not grand acts of rebellion, but small, quiet moments of defiance. A woman might secretly keep a letter from someone she cared for, hide a ribbon in a color considered too bold, or choose to smile at someone she wasn't supposed to. These small acts, though seemingly trivial, were ways of holding on to a sense of self in a world that sought to control every aspect of their lives. The life of a medieval woman was full of unspoken rules. She was expected to be modest in dress, soft in speech, and diligent in her household duties. Even her thoughts were expected to be pure and devoted to her family and faith. But being human meant that thoughts and feelings did not always follow rules. A glance, a moment of curiosity, or a passing daydream could leave her feeling conflicted, wondering if she had sinned in ways she did not fully understand. Consider the story of a young woman in a small village who was rumored to have been too friendly with a traveling merchant. Perhaps all she did was smile at him in the marketplace, or pause to ask about goods from distant lands. But in a community where everyone watches everyone else, that small moment could be twisted into something scandalous. Soon, the whispers grow louder, and she finds herself standing before the local priest, forced to confess not just her actions, but also her intentions, as though even the flicker of a thought must be weighed and judged. For women of higher status, the rules were different but equally suffocating. A noblewoman might live in a grand castle with fine clothing and servants, but her every move was watched by courtiers, servants, and family members. A misplaced glance, a private letter, or a rumor whispered in the wrong ear could lead to disgrace. Unlike peasant women, who might quietly endure gossip in their village, a noblewoman's reputation could affect the power and alliances of entire families. A single scandal could destroy carefully arranged marriages or political plans. Some women, aware of how fragile their reputations were, learned to live carefully and cautiously. They spoke softly, avoided unnecessary conversations with men, and presented themselves as models of piety. Others, however, found ways to bend the rules. A few women discovered that by carefully managing gossip, they could turn it to their advantage. A whispered rumor could distract from another secret, or a well-timed act of generosity could silence critics. Even within this strict environment, there were places where women's voices found expression. Folk songs, for example, often contained hidden messages about love, longing, and hardship. While these songs might seem simple, they carried stories that women could not openly tell. A mother might sing a lullaby to a child that included subtle lessons about survival, caution, and hope. A group of women gathering to work might hum tunes that hinted at their shared struggles and quiet dreams. There is something deeply human about the way women of the Middle Ages balanced the weight of public judgment with their private selves. They were not simply victims of the system. Though the system was harsh, they were also survivors, finding ways to live within awe, just outside the boundaries that were drawn for them. Yet, we must ask ourselves, how many women's lives were changed or even destroyed by the simple act of being misunderstood? How many secrets were buried, never told, because speaking them aloud would bring ruin? By the final decades of the 19th century, the culture of bathing in Britain was changing rapidly. What had once been seen as a rare and ceremonial act was beginning to take on new meaning, thanks to advances in science, plumbing, and public health. The late Victorian era marked a transitional moment, where the idea of cleanliness began to shift from being about appearances and social class to something tied to the very notion of health and respectability. This change was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. And by the time Queen Victoria's long reign came to an end in 1901, bathing habits were far more modern than they had been in her early years. A major catalyst for this transformation was the growing acceptance of germ theory. While early Victorians had believed that foul air or miasma spread disease, scientists like Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister were proven that invisible microorganisms were the true culprits. Lister, in particular, revolutionized medical hygiene by introducing antiseptic procedures in surgery, dramatically reducing infection rates. These discoveries had a profound impact on public attitudes toward cleanliness. Suddenly, washing the body, the hands, and even clothing was no longer just a matter of looking presentable or smelling pleasant. It became a way to prevent disease and maintain good health. This scientific understanding also affected architecture and home design. Indoor bathrooms were increasingly viewed as a necessity for the middle and upper classes, rather than a luxury reserved for the elite. By the 1880s and 1890s, new houses were being built with bathrooms that featured fixed bathtubs, running water, and even early flush toilets. These innovations were made possible by the expansion of municipal water supplies and the development of reliable sewage systems. Projects that were driven by the lessons learned from events like London's Great Stink of 1858. While most working-class homes still lacked these amenities, the expectation of better sanitation was growing, and public bathhouses continued to fill the gap. The shift toward more frequent bathing was also encouraged by the booming soap industry. Companies like Lever Brothers, which would later become part of Unilever, began marketing soap as a product for everyone, not just the wealthy. Their advertisements linked soap use with purity, good health, and even moral character. Slogans and illustrations suggested that a well-washed person was not only healthier but also more respectable and virtuous. This was particularly appealing to the rising middle class, who wanted to demonstrate their refinement and social standing. As soap became more affordable thanks to industrial production and the reduction of taxes, more people began to incorporate it into their weekly or even daily washing routines. For Queen Victoria and her family, the later years of her reign saw the installation of more advanced plumbing systems in royal residences. Bathrooms were fitted with elegant porcelain fixtures, tiled walls, and improved heating, making bathing more comfortable and practical. Victoria, who had grown up with the belief that too much bathing was risky, may not have embraced daily bathing, but she certainly benefited from these modern conveniences. By this time, she also had access to a wider range of personal care products, including higher quality soaps, lotions, and tooth powders. Her daily routine likely included a combination of sponge, baths, scented water, and occasional full immersions, all of which reflected the evolving standards of the era. The concept of cleanliness as modernity was not just limited to personal hygiene, it extended to public spaces and civic pride. Streets were being cleaned more regularly, sewage systems were expanded, and clean water was prioritized as a matter of public policy. These improvements were partly a response to health crises like cholera outbreaks, but they also reflected a cultural shift toward order and progress. Cleanliness became a symbol of a civilized, forward-looking society, and bathing was at the heart of this new identity. One fascinating aspect of late Victorian bathing culture was the blending of old rituals with new technology. While some still preferred the slow, luxurious baths filled with herbs and oils, others began embracing the convenience of quick washes. The first shower-like devices, which used a pump to spray water over the body, began appearing in wealthier homes toward the end of the century. Though these early showers were far from the modern designs we know today, they marked the beginning of a new approach to washing, a faster, more efficient method that would become the norm in the 20th century. Public bathhouses also became more sophisticated during this period. Municipal bathhouses began offering hot showers alongside traditional tubs, and some even included steam rooms and swimming pools. These facilities were often grand in design, with tiled walls, large windows, and decorative fixtures. For the working classes, they were not just places to wash, but also spaces for social interaction and community life. A Saturday evening trip to the public baths became part of the weekly routine for many families, preparing them for Sunday church services and the coming work week. While bathing was becoming more common, hair washing remained relatively infrequent. Victorian women, in particular, continued to rely on brushing and powders to keep their hair looking presentable between washes. Elaborate hairstyles, which required pins, oils, and pomades, made frequent washing impractical. It wasn't until the early 20th century that regular hair washing became more widespread. With the introduction of liquid shampoos and simpler hairstyles, clothing hygiene also underwent changes during the late Victorian period. With the growing availability of washing machines, still rudimentary but increasingly common in wealthier homes, laundering became easier and less destructive to fabrics. White cotton undergarments became popular, partly because they could be boiled to achieve a higher level of cleanliness. This emphasis on clean underclothes was another sign of the era's changing attitudes. As people became more aware of the importance of hygiene for health, it's worth remembering that while these advancements were significant, they were unevenly distributed across society. The wealthy and middle classes could afford bathrooms, hot water, and modern soap, but the poor still struggled with limited access to clean facilities. For many working-class families, a weekly bath at the public bathhouse remained a standard well into the 20th century. Yet, the cultural expectation that people should be clean and well-groomed, and even those with limited resources, tried to follow the new norms as best they could. By the time Queen Victoria's reign ended, bathing had transformed from a rare luxury to a symbol of progress and respectability. Her own habits, which once reflected the cautious approach of early Victorians, had evolved alongside the times. While she may not have bathed daily, the improvements she and Prince Albert supported: better plumbing, cleaner water, and modern bathrooms paved the way for the hygiene standards we take for granted today. Looking back at this era, it's interesting to think about how much our modern routines owed to slow, often awkward transition of the 19th century. The Victorians may have bathed less frequently, but they set in motion the cultural and technological changes that would make cleanliness a cornerstone of daily life. Their fascination with perfumes, floral waters, and soaps has echoes in our own shelves, filled with shampoos, conditioners, and scented body washes. It raises a final question that lingers in the quiet of history. Would a Victorian stepping into one of our modern bathrooms with its gleaming tiles and instant hot water have felt that we had taken the concept of bathing too far, or would they have been amazed at how something so laborious in their time had become so effortless? In a world where reputation was everything, Women often walked through life with an unspoken caution, aware that any small act could be magnified into scandal. A simple conversation with a stranger could become the seed of a damaging story. A laugh at the wrong time could be interpreted as a sign of loose morals. It was not enough to live a good life. One also had to appear to live correctly in the eyes of neighbors, priests, and family members. The smallest whispers of doubt could snowball into accusations, and once those whispers began, they were nearly impossible to silence. Consider how gossip worked in a medieval village. Houses were close together, doors rarely had locks, and the market square served as the heart of all daily life. People observed one another constantly, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes as a form of entertainment. If a woman stayed out too late, someone would comment. If she seemed too cheerful while speaking to a man who wasn't her husband, someone would notice. This was especially true in rural communities, where life moved slowly, and every small detail of behavior seemed to matter. Confession played a strange role in this cycle of judgment. While the church presented confession as a sacred opportunity for forgiveness, it also became a source of fear. Women were encouraged to tell every detail of their private thoughts to priests, yet doing so sometimes placed them under closer watch. A priest who believed a woman was too bold or too curious might instruct her husband or family to monitor her more closely. There was a sense that a woman's thoughts needed to be policed, as though her private feelings were not entirely her own. This atmosphere led to a culture of many women learned to hide their thoughts, even from those they trusted. Their true opinions or desires were tucked away like secret treasures, shared only with a sister, a mother, or a close friend. Some women found solace in these quiet confidences, while others carried their secrets like heavy stones, afraid that speaking them aloud would invite punishment or shame. In towns and villages across Europe, punishment for women who stepped outside expected roles could be both harsh and humiliating. Public shaming was a common tool. Women might be made to sit on a cucking stool by the village pond, exposed to mocking laughter, or thrown into the water as part of their humiliation. Others were forced to wear symbolic clothing, a rough garment, a sign, or even a paper hat, declaring their supposed offenses. These punishments were not just about correcting behavior. They were designed to remind every other woman of the consequences of stepping out of line. It is worth noting that these punishments often had less to do with the severity of an act and more to do with control. A man who behaved inappropriately might face mild consequences, but a woman who did the same would bear the full weight of communal outrage. The unspoken rule was that women were responsible not just for their own behavior, but for the moral fabric of the community. If something went wrong, if there was scandal, if someone fell ill, if crops failed, women were often the first to be blamed. Among noble families, punishment took different forms. A noble woman who broke social expectations might not be paraded through the streets, but her disgrace could be equally devastating. She might be sent away to a convent, cut off from her family, and stripped of her inheritance. Her name could be erased from records, or spoken only in whispers. For a woman of high birth, honor was everything, and once that honor was questioned, her future could collapse. Yet, despite the dangers, women found ways to keep their secrets safe. Many developed a kind of quiet intelligence, learning how to navigate conversations carefully and how to say just enough, but never too much. Some women became skilled at redirecting gossip, planting small, harmless stories to distract from more personal truths. Others learned to live in the gray areas of society, neither fully obedient nor openly rebellious, but always watchful, always calculating. There were also moments of unexpected solidarity among women. While gossip could be cruel, it could also create bonds. Women shared advice, comfort, and warnings with one another. A friend might whisper about which priest was kind, and which one liked to pry too deeply in confession. A neighbor might cover for a young woman who needed to avoid unwanted attention. These networks of quiet support helped women survive a system designed to limit them. Even within the church itself, there were women who navigated the rules with subtle skill. Nuns and abbesses often acted as confidants, hearing the worries of wives, daughters, and widows who had no one else to trust. While the church officially upheld strict teachings, These women of faith sometimes offered compassion and understanding that went beyond doctrine. In their letters and writings, we find rare glimpses of women acknowledging the hardships of being judged for feelings that were entirely natural. There was a strange contradiction in medieval society. Women were both feared and admired. They were celebrated for their roles as mothers, wives, and caretakers, yet constantly warned against stepping beyond those roles. A woman who displayed confidence or independence could be labeled dangerous, while one who was too quiet or withdrawn might be seen as hiding something. There was no perfect way to exist in such a system. Every choice carried the risk of judgment. Imagine, for a moment, a young woman preparing to enter confession. She kneels before the booth, her hands trembling slightly as she considers what to say. Does she admit to the thoughts she had while watching the night ride past the village? Does she speak of the anger she felt when her father dismissed her opinion at the dinner table? Or does she stay silent, choosing instead to confess something trivial to avoid drawing suspicion? These decisions were not small. In a society where the soul was believed to be at constant risk, even a private thought could feel like a heavy burden. And yet, despite the fear and the rigid expectations, women endured. They carried their secrets quietly, protecting not just themselves, but also the small joys. They could find moments of laughter with friends, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with their hands, and the simple pleasure of a song hummed while working. These moments were never recorded in chronicles or official histories, but they were real, and they mattered. How many of these untold stories were buried with the women who lived them? How many secrets faded into silence because no one thought they were worth preserving? The story of soap in the 19th century is a story of a quiet revolution, one that changed how people thought about cleanliness, health, and even morality. Before the 1800s, soap was a luxury. It was made in small batches, often by hand, and used sparingly because of its cost. For centuries, many people across Europe relied more on water, cloths, and natural scrubbing agents like ashes or sand rather than true soap. But during the Victorian age, something remarkable happened. From the palace to the poorest backstreet home began to recognize as essential. At the beginning of the 19th century, soap was taxed in Britain, making it an expensive household item for ordinary families. The high price meant they used it rarely, if at all. A single bar of soap might be carefully rationed for washing hands, faces, and the occasional laundry. Most people used plain water for cleaning and sometimes a bit of ash or clay for scrubbing. The tax on soap was seen as unfair, especially since soap was so closely tied to health and sanitation. Campaigns to reduce or eliminate the tax grew stronger as the century went on. By 1853, the soap tax was finally repealed, opening the door for soap to become more affordable and widely available. The repeal of the soap tax coincided with advancements in industrial manufacturing. Large-scale soap production meant that what was once handmade and inconsistent could now be produced in factories, cut into uniform bars, and sold across the country. Companies like Pears, which had started as small soap makers, became household names by the mid-1800s. Pears' transparent soap, with its distinctive clarity and gentle fragrance, was marketed not just as a cleaning product, but as a luxury item for refined gentlemen and ladies. Its advertisements, which often featured romantic imagery or appeals to good health, played a major role in turning soap into a symbol of respectability. Soap's transformation was not just about clever marketing. However, it was tied to the growing awareness of public health. As industrial cities grew larger and more crowded, the link between dirt, disease, and poor living conditions became impossible to ignore. Repeated outbreaks of cholera and typhoid forced governments, doctors, and ordinary people to consider the importance of cleanliness. While germ theory was still in its infancy, the idea that washing could prevent illness began to take hold. Soap, with its ability to remove dirt and oils, became a small but powerful weapon in the fight against disease. The wealthy embraced soap not only for hygiene but also for status. To have scented soap, beautifully wrapped in paper or stored in carved boxes, was a mark of refinement. soap making itself was elevated from a craft to an art form, with manufacturers experimenting with colors, shapes, and fragrances. Some soaps were infused with floral oils, while others included ingredients like honey or almond oil to soften the skin. For Queen Victoria's household, such products would have been a staple of daily life, even if baths were infrequent. A quick sponge, bath with scented soap and a splash of rose water could leave a person feeling refreshed without the effort of a full immersion. Laundry soap, too, underwent a transformation. Before industrial soap production, washing clothes was a brutal and labor-intensive process. Women boiled linens in large cauldrons with homemade lye soap, which was harsh and damaging to fabrics. The advent of milder, more effective soaps made laundering slightly less punishing, though it was still far from easy. By the mid-19th century, soap flakes and powders were being sold for laundry, promising better results with less effort. These developments were crucial for the growing middle class, who wanted clean, bright clothing as a sign of respectability. The advertising boom of the Victorian era played a key role in shaping public attitudes towards soap. Manufacturers understood that they weren't just selling a product, they were selling an idea. Soap was marketed as a tool of progress, civilization, and moral virtue. Advertisements often featured images of clean, happy families with sparkling white linens and well-groomed children. Some ads even carried subtle messages about class and race, suggesting that cleanliness was a mark of superiority or sophistication. While these messages were problematic by modern standards, they reveal how strongly soap became linked to notions of identity and social standing. One of the most interesting aspects of this revolution was how soap intersected with imperialism. As the British Empire expanded, soap companies began using colonial imagery to market their products. Palm oil from Africa and coconut oil from India became key ingredients in soap making, and advertisements sometimes depicted civilizing missions tied to the use of soap. These narratives reinforced the idea that soap was not just about cleanliness, but about bringing order and progress to the world, a theme that fit neatly into the Victorian worldview. In homes across Britain, the presence of soap became more common by the late 19th century. Families kept bars of soap near washstands, often alongside basins of water, brushes, and towels. A morning or evening wash with soap and water became part of the daily routine, even for those who could not afford frequent baths. This simple ritual marked a turning point in personal hygiene, helping to reduce the spread of disease and raising the overall standard of health. Yet, soap was not without its critics. Some traditionalists believed that using too much soap would weaken the skin or cause illnesses by opening the pores. Others viewed the growing obsession with cleanliness as a form of vanity or excess. Still, the practical benefits of soap were undeniable, and by the time Queen Victoria's grandchildren were growing up, regular washing with soap had become a cultural norm among the upper and middle classes. For the working classes, soap remained both a blessing and a burden. It was cheaper than before, but still something to be budgeted carefully. Many families would use plain, unscented soap for all purposes: washing hands, scrubbing floors, and cleaning clothes. Despite its simplicity, this plain soap represented a step toward better living conditions. It meant fewer illnesses, less visible dirt, and a sense of dignity in an age where class distinctions were often drawn along the lines of appearance and grooming. The story of soap in the Victorian era is also a story of changing perceptions. What had once been seen as a costly luxury became a basic necessity. It bridged the gap between health and beauty, between utility and refinement. It was not just a product, but a symbol of the new industrial AGA small bar. It represented the power of science, trade, and marketing to transform everyday life. As you think about how ordinary soap shaped the 19th century, it's interesting to consider how we view it today. Soap is so commonplace that we rarely think about it at all. We have dozens of varieties: liquid bar, antibacterial, scented, or unscented, each promising its own version of cleanliness. But with the Victorians, who saw soap as a sign of progress and sophistication, recognize their reflection in our modern obsession with hygiene products? Or would they see it as simply the natural continuation of the revolution they started? As the Victorian age progressed, soap was no longer just a product used by the wealthy. It was becoming a household staple for people across Britain. The repeal of the soap tax in 1853 had opened the door to mass production, and industrial innovation quickly followed. Factories were able to produce large quantities of soap at lower costs, and this transformed how families approached daily cleaning. No longer was soap something to be saved for special occasions. It was now an essential part of maintaining respectability, health, and even moral virtue in the eyes of society. The growth of industrial soap making was fueled by both scientific advancements and clever marketing. Traditionally, soap was made using animal fats, combined with wood ash or lye, a process that required careful handling and time-consuming preparation. Industrial manufacturers refined this process using steam and improved chemical techniques to produce soap that was smoother, longer-lasting, and more pleasant to use. The use of vegetable oils, such as palm and coconut oils, imported from colonies, gave soaps a softer texture and a more delicate fragrance. These new soaps were no longer harsh and gritty. They could be perfumed with floral oils, wrapped in attractive packaging, and sold as both a necessity and a luxury. The marketing of soap in Victorian Britain cannot be overstated. Companies like Pears and Leverbros revolutionized advertising during this time, creating some of the first large-scale branding campaigns. Pears, transparent soap, with its distinctive clarity and mild scent, became a symbol of refinement. Advertisements claimed that it was recommended by all the best medical authorities and praised for its ability to maintain both cleanliness and beauty. These claims were often exaggerated, but they were effective in convincing the growing middle class that soap was not merely a cleaning agent, it was an essential part of a healthy, modern life. Lever Brothers, founded in 1885 by William Lever, took soap marketing to new heights. This company as Sunlight soap was sold not just as a cleaning product, but as a way to bring brightness and happiness into the home. Lever's advertisements often featured idyllic domestic smiling mothers, sparkling white linens, and children with glowing, clean faces. The message was clear. Using soap was not just about hygiene, but about being a good, respectable family. This moral link between cleanliness and character was one of the defining features of Victorian society, and soap became a key symbol of that connection. For the middle and upper classes, soap was increasingly used in both personal care and household cleaning. Basins and washstands became common fixtures in bedrooms, and a bar of soap was often placed next to a jug of water for morning and evening washing. Even those who did not take full baths daily began to wash their hands, faces, and underarms with soap as part of their regular routine. Towels and sponges were used to scrub the skin, and the ritual of washing became a way to start and end the day feeling refreshed. For the working classes, the availability of cheaper soap meant that families could maintain a higher level of cleanliness than ever before. Plain, unscented laundry soap was used for everything, from scrubbing hands to washing clothes and floors. While these soaps lacked the delicate fragrances of the upper-class varieties, they were effective and durable. Public health campaigns encouraged working-class families to wash more frequently, associating cleanliness with better health and a more respectable appearance. Soap also became a political and social tool during the Victorian era. Campaigners for public health reforms used soap as a symbol of progress and civility. Pamphlets and lectures emphasized that washing with soap could reduce the spread of disease and improve overall well-being. These messages were particularly targeted at industrial cities, where cramped living conditions and poor sanitation made disease outbreaks all too common. In some cases, charities even distributed soap to the poor as part of their efforts to improve living standards. Queen Victoria's household reflected this growing focus on cleanliness, though her personal bathing habits remained rooted in the traditions of her youth. She was known to appreciate the finer varieties of soap, often handmade and infused with rose or lavender oils. Prince Albert's interest in modern sanitation likely extended to the use of soap in the royal household. ensuring that washing became a more regular part of daily routines for the family and their staff. The royal endorsement of soap as both a luxury and a necessity helped reinforce its cultural importance. An interesting side effect of this soap revolution was the way it influenced fashion and grooming. Clean, white cotton undergarments became a standard of respectability, especially since they could be boiled with soap to remove stains and odors. The emphasis on clean skin and clean clothes was tied directly to social status. A person with dirty hands or soiled clothing risked being seen as lazy or immoral, while those who were clean and well-presented were viewed as disciplined and Soap, therefore, was not just about hygiene, it was a marker of social class. As the century went on, new varieties of soap were developed to cater to different needs. Carbolic soap, which contained disinfectant properties, became popular for its ability to fight germs. It was often recommended for hospitals and public institutions, but many households began using it as well, particularly during outbreaks of disease. The smell of carbolic soap, sharp and medicinal, a sign that one was protected from invisible dangers. The global reach of the British Empire also played a role in the soap industry's growth. Colonies provided the raw materials needed for soap making, such as palm oil from West Africa and coconut oil from India and Southeast Asia. These ingredients not only improved the quality of soap, but also made large-scale production possible. British soap manufacturers often used colonial imagery in their advertising, promoting the idea that soap was part of the civilizing mission of the empire. This connection between soap, cleanliness, and imperial pride became a recurring theme in late Victorian culture. Soap was also linked to the growing concept of childhood as a time of innocence and purity. Advertisements frequently featured images of clean, happy children, their rosy faces glowing with health. Mothers were told that using gentle soaps was essential for protecting their children's delicate skin and ensuring they grew up healthy and presentable. This ideal of the clean child became a powerful image in Victorian society, reinforcing the idea that cleanliness was both a personal and a moral duty. Looking at these developments, it is easy to see how soap became more than just a household item. It became a symbol of progress, health, and respectability. By the end of the 19th century, the idea of washing regularly with soap had become deeply ingrained in middle-class culture, while the working poor still struggled with access to clean water and bathing facilities. Even they recognized the importance of soap as a tool for maintaining dignity in a harsh and judgmental world. The story of soap in the Victorian era is, in many ways, the story of modern hygiene itself. It was during this time that the simple act of washing with soap became tied to larger ideas about science, morality, and civilization. It was no longer enough to simply appear clean. The belief that true cleanliness could protect against illness and demonstrate good character had taken hold. But this raises an interesting thought. How much of this was about genuine hygiene, and how much was about social expectations? Did Victorians truly believe that soap could keep them healthy? Or was it simply another way of showing they belonged to a respectable class? Perhaps it was a bit of both, a blend of practical benefit and cultural symbolism that shaped habits for generations to come. When night fell over medieval towns and villages, the quiet streets echoed with the weight of rules that were rarely spoken but always understood. For women, life under the church's watchful gaze was a careful dance of appearances and silence. Every action, every word, and even every thought was filtered through the question of whether it aligned with the church's teachings. Yet, behind this veneer of obedience, women carried private world's moments of affection, curiosity, and defiance that were hidden from the judgment of priests and neighbors. The church's power was strongest in the smallest, most ordinary details of daily life. It wasn't just in the grand sermons or the ringing bells on Sundays. It was in the way women dressed, the way they were expected to walk with lowered eyes, and the way their conversations were kept quiet and polite. The church set the standard for what was considered proper, and anyone who strayed too far risked being labeled sinful. For a woman, that label could mean ruin. A single careless word from a neighbor could spiral into public shame. And public shame was often worse than any punishment, because it lingered in every glance and whisper long after the event itself had passed. Marriage, the cornerstone of a woman's existence in the eyes of the church, was a contract as much as a personal relationship. Love and personal choice played almost no part in it. Instead, marriage was treated as a duty-some thing that existed for the stability of families and communities. A woman's life revolved around her role as a wife and mother, and her value was tied to how well she fulfilled that role. But even within marriage, the church asserted itself, dictating what was considered appropriate and what was not. Rules about when couples could be together were strict and sometimes absurd, based on the belief that physical intimacy should be limited to certain days and for the sole purpose of producing children. Pleasure, especially for women, was rarely spoken of, except as something to be wary of or ashamed of. Confession reinforced these ideas. Women were urged to reveal their private thoughts, to admit to feelings or moments that might not align with the church's teachings. But how many women confessed to feelings that were simply part of being human, moments of joy, curiosity, or longing that were harmless in themselves? To confess such things was to hand over a part of themselves to an authority that did not always understand or value their inner lives. Yet to remain silent carried its own risks, for failing to confess was seen as a sign of stubbornness or rebellion. Some women must have learned to navigate confession with careful strategy, sharing just enough to appear obedient, while keeping their most private thoughts to themselves. This balancing act required intelligence and subtlety, and it was one of the many quiet ways women resisted the total control of the church. Though they lived under constant scrutiny, they found ways to protect their inner selves, to maintain a sense of identity that went beyond what they were told they could be. The power of the church over women's lives was not just spiritual, it was deeply social. Villages and towns were small, close-knit places where everyone knew one another's business. A priest's opinion could carry as much weight as a judge's, and his words could determine whether a woman was seen as virtuous or sinful. In such an environment, women had to be cautious. They had to guard not just their actions, but also their reputations, because a damaged reputation could affect their family's standing, their marriage prospects, and even their survival. Yet within these constraints, women showed remarkable resilience. They formed close bonds with other women, sharing advice, stories, and quiet moments of solidarity. In kitchens, gardens, and spinning circles, they talked about the challenges of their lives in ways they never could in public. These private conversations were a form of strength, a way to remind one another that they were not alone in navigating the impossible expectations placed upon them. Through these bonds, women preserved traditions, passed down knowledge, and supported each other in ways that the church could never fully control. In noble courts, where appearances were everything, the church's influence was just as strong. Though it took on a different shape, noble women were expected to be paragons of virtue, their behavior scrutinized by courtiers and priests alike. A single rumor could damage a family's reputation or undermine political alliances. Yet even in these rigid settings, women found subtle ways to exert influence. A noble woman might use her intelligence and charm, advising her husband, or forging alliances through quiet conversations. Though her power was not recognized openly, it was real, and it often shaped the course of events in ways that history books rarely acknowledge. One cannot help but imagine the private thoughts of these women, those who lived in grand halls as well as those who toiled in fields. Did they question the rules they were given? Did they wonder why their own feelings and desires were treated as dangerous or sinful? Did they dream of a life with more freedom, where they could laugh, speak, and live without fear of judgment? The written records of the time offer few answers, because most of what we know comes from men, priests, chroniclers, and rulers who rarely recorded women's voices. Yet the silences in these records speak volumes. They remind us of how much remains unknown, how many lives were lived in quiet complexity. Despite the church's efforts to control every aspect of life, it could not erase the human spirit. Women found joy in small things, in the warmth of the sun on a cold morning, in the laughter of children, in the satisfaction of a well-kept home, or a successful harvest. These moments, though ordinary, were acts of survival. They were reminders that life was not only about rules and sermons, but also about the small, beautiful details that made existence bearable. Looking back, it is easy to see the church's influence as unyielding and absolute, but the reality was more complicated. While its teachings were powerful, they were not always followed perfectly. People, especially women, found ways to adapt, to bend the rules quietly, without breaking them outright. Some married couples ignored the restrictions about when they could be together, while others found ways to express affection in private, beyond the church's gaze. These quiet acts of defiance were never recorded, but they must have existed, because no human life can be lived entirely according to someone else's rules. In the end, the story of how the church controlled women's lives is not just about oppression. It is also about resilience, adaptability, and the quiet strength of women who endured. They may not have been able to change the system, but they found ways to carve out spaces for themselves within it. Spaces where their voices, though quiet, could still be heard. The question that lingers is how many of their stories remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered in the fragments of songs, letters, and traditions that have survived the centuries. If you could step into the private chambers of Queen Victoria during her morning routine, you would quickly notice something that might surprise you. Her approach to oral hygiene was vastly different from the standards we know today. In fact, tooth care during the Victorian era was a mixture of old-fashioned remedies, early innovations, and a fair amount of guesswork. The Victorians were just beginning to understand the importance of dental health, but many of their methods were primitive, abrasive, or downright strange by modern standards. Yet, for someone of Queen Victoria's status, having clean and presentable teeth was as much about image as it was about health. Dental hygiene in the 1800s was an area of rapid change. Before this period, most people did little more than rinse their mouths with water, chew herbs for fresh breath, or use rough claws to wipe their teeth. Toothbrushes, as we know them, were relatively new, having only gained popularity in Britain in the late 18th century. These early toothbrushes were typically made with handles of wood, bone, or ivory, and bristles fashioned from the stiff hairs of boars. By Queen Victoria's time, such brushes had become more common among the upper classes, though they were still far from the soft, synthetic brushes we take for granted today. The bristles were often so coarse that they could damage gums and wear down enamel if used too vigorously. The Queen herself is believed to have owned fine quality, likely with ivory handles, and carefully selected bristles. However, the real challenge wasn't just to brush it, was what to use on it. Modern toothpaste did not exist yet. Instead, Victorians used tooth powders, which were typically made from a blend of abrasive substances like chalk, crushed seashells, or even powdered brick. These powders were mixed with flavoring agents such as peppermint or clove oil to improve the taste. While these gritty mixtures were somewhat effective at removing surface stains, they were harsh on teeth and could wear them down over time. Sugar consumption during the Victorian era was on the rise, thanks to Britain's colonial trade and the booming popularity of sweets, jams, and pastries. This surge in sugar intake led to widespread dental problems, even among the wealthy. Tooth decay, cavities, and gum disease were common complaints. For someone like Queen Victoria, whose image as a dignified and regal figure depended on her appearance, dental care was particularly important. She relied on the best practices of the time, brushing her teeth regularly with tooth powder and using mouth rinses made from simple ingredients like water, mixed with mint or vinegar. These rinses were intended to freshen breath and provide a sense of cleanliness. The Victorians also believed in the power of natural remedies for dental care. Charcoal was a popular ingredient for cleaning teeth, as it was thought to whiten them by scrubbing away stains. In some households, baking soda was used as a mild abrasive. There were even recipes that called for mixing tooth powder with honey or wine to create a paste. Though these concoctions were sticky and not particularly effective, Queen Victoria, with her access to royal apothecaries and imported goods, likely used more refined versions of these mixtures, perhaps with added herbs or floral essences. to mask any unpleasant flavors. Dentistry as a profession was still developing during the 19th century. Many dental procedures were performed by barbers or general surgeons, and anesthesia was in its infancy. Tooth extractions were common, and they were often done with little more than a swig of brandy for pain relief. For the upper classes, including the royal family, there were specialists who offered more advanced treatments, such as gold fillings or rudimentary dentures. It is said that Queen Victoria had relatively healthy teeth for her age, which was impressive given the limited tools and knowledge of the time, beyond brushing and powders. The Victorians were very conscious of fresh breath, which was considered essential for polite society. People chewed on sprigs of mint, cloves, or parsley to freshen their breath, while others carried small tins of breath, lozenges, or candies. Perfumed handkerchiefs were also common, allowing one to discreetly cover their mouth if bad breath was suspected. For the Queen and her court, maintaining a fresh and pleasant presence was not just about personal comfort, it was about setting a standard of elegance and refinement. Children's dental care in the Victorian era was minimal compared to today. Most families did not emphasize brushing until a child's permanent teeth had grown in, and by then, damage was often already done among the wealthy. However, there was a growing awareness of the need for early dental care. Queen Victoria's children would have had access to the best available toothbrushes and powder, and their governesses likely ensured they followed a routine, though it would have been far less strict than modern standards. Tooth whitening was also a concern for some Victorians, particularly among the upper classes, who valued a bright smile. Home remedies ranged from rubbing teeth with lemon peel to rinsing with diluted acids, which unfortunately did more harm than good by eroding enamel. Others used powders made with burnt bread or pumice stone to polish their teeth. These practices were risky, but they reflected a desire to achieve a clean and youthful appearance. What's particularly fascinating is how oral hygiene intersected with social expectations. A person with stained or missing teeth might be viewed as neglectful or of lower class, while someone with a clean and well-maintained smile signaled wealth and self. This emphasis on appearance created a demand for better dental care products, leading to the rise of early commercial tooth powders and brushes. Some companies began to package tooth powder in small tins with elegant designs, marketing them as luxury items for the fashionable household. Despite these advancements, toothaches were a common and dreaded problem in Victorian Britain. Without modern fillings, root canals, or orthodontics, most dental pain was addressed by extraction. Traveling dentists would set up temporary shops, offering to pull teeth quickly, often without proper sterilization. For the Queen and her court, however, dental care would have been more refined. Court dentists and royal physicians had access to the latest tools and knowledge, though even these were primitive by modern standards. Thinking about these routines, it's remarkable to see how far we've come. The Victorians, with their boar bristle brushes and chalk-based powders, were doing their best with the knowledge they had. For Queen Victoria, tooth care was less about preventing cavities and more about maintaining an image of health and sophistication. Yet even with her resources, the methods were abrasive and far from perfect. As you imagine Queen Victoria beginning her day dressed in layers of silk and velvet, sitting at a polished wooden vanity with a toothbrush made of ivory, you might wonder how different her experience would have been if she had access to modern toothpastes, electric toothbrushes, or dental floss. Would she have been astonished by the ease and effectiveness of our tools, or would she have found them unnecessary, given that her own standards of oral care were already considered advanced for the time? As the Victorian era progressed, the world of dentistry began to evolve, though it remained far from what we consider modern dental care. For much of Queen Victoria's reign, dental practitioners were still a mixture of barbers, surgeons, and traveling tradesmen who offered quick fixes rather than preventative care. Yet, among the wealthy, dentistry was becoming a specialized profession, with dedicated practitioners and early dental offices emerging in major cities like London and Edinburgh. This shift was partly driven by growing awareness of how dental appearance and oral health were linked to social class and personal refinement. For Queen Victoria and her family, Dental care was not only about health, but also about the image of royalty. The queen, who was constantly in the public eye, needed to present an appearance of vitality and dignity. While few detailed records of her dental routines survive, it is known that the royal household had access to the best dentists of the era. These professionals would have offered services such as cleaning, polishing, and, when necessary, extracting decayed teeth. Gold fillings were occasionally used, though they were expensive and often uncomfortable. Tooth decay was a widespread problem during the Victorian era, largely due to the rising consumption of sugar. The 19th century saw a boom in sugary foods, from biscuits and puddings to jams and sweetened tea. This was especially true in upper-class households, where access to imported sugar from colonies was easy and affordable. While Queen Victoria's personal love of sweets, such as her famous fondness for sponge cake, is well documented, it is likely that her dental care routine had to be more vigilant to counter the effects of a sugar-heavy diet. Tooth powders remained the primary cleaning agent for much of the 19th century. Wealthy households, including the royal court, would have had beautifully packaged tins of tooth powder on their vanities. These powders often included finely ground chalk or oyster shells, along with flavorings like cinnamon, peppermint, or clove oil. Some recipes even included powdered charcoal, which was believed to whiten teeth. While these abrasive mixtures removed surface stains, they could also erode enamel if used too frequently. Nonetheless, they were considered cutting-edge for the time, and their use was a mark of sophistication. In addition to tooth powders, Victorians experimented with a variety of mouth rinses and home remedies. A common rinse might consist of water mixed with vinegar, or a few drops of aromatic oils, such as peppermint or eucalyptus. These concoctions were meant to freshen breath and give a clean feeling, though their antibacterial properties were limited. Among the wealthy, it was also fashionable to use imported tooth tinctures or mouth elixirs sold by apothecaries, which were marketed as both cleansing and refreshing. Some of these products contained alcohol or herbal extracts that left a strong taste, but offered little real protection against decay. Perhaps the most bizarre aspect of Victorian dental care was the array of folk remedies and superstitions that still lingered from earlier centuries. Some people believed that rubbing teeth with burnt toast, crushed brick, or even gunpowder would keep them white and strong. Others swore by brushing with salt or baking soda. While a few of these methods did have mild cleaning properties, many were harsh and damaging. It's unlikely that Queen Victoria herself would have resorted to such crude techniques, but her subjects certainly did, especially in rural areas where professional dentistry was scarce. Dentures were another area of development during this period. For those who lost multiple teeth, false teeth made from materials like ivory, porcelain, or even real human teeth were an option, albeit an expensive and uncomfortable one. These dentures were often ill-fitting and prone to breaking, but they provided an aesthetic solution in a time when a full smile was associated with youth and vitality. While there is no solid evidence that Queen Victoria required dentures, many of her contemporaries, including prominent politicians and aristocrats, relied on them to maintain their public appearance. Children's dental care also began to receive more attention during the Victorian period, at least among the middle and upper classes. The royal children likely had their teeth cleaned and brushed under the watchful eyes of government. By the mid-1800s, manufacturers began producing smaller toothbrushes for children, encouraging early dental habits. However, the idea of regular dental checkups was still decades away, and tooth pain was often managed with rudimentary remedies, such as clove oil or herbal poultices. Interestingly, the Victorian fascination with oral hygiene extended beyond practical care to aesthetics and presentation. Advertisements for tooth powders and brushes often portrayed people with gleaming white teeth, suggesting that a bright smile was an indicator of good health and refined taste. These early marketing campaigns played a powerful role in shaping public expectations, just as soap companies were tying personal cleanliness to morality and social standing. Dental care products were starting to do the same. The connection between oral hygiene and social class was particularly pronounced. A clean, well-kept mouth was a sign of wealth, as it suggested access to the latest dental tools and powders. In contrast, stained or missing teeth were often associated with poverty or poor habits. This divide was especially evident in Victorian London, where the elite displayed their polished smiles at social gatherings, while working-class citizens often struggled with untreated dental problems due to the cost of care. One of the challenges of Victorian dental health was the lack of effective pain relief. Toothaches were common, and without modern anesthetics, even a simple extraction was a painful ordeal. Wealthier individuals sometimes received rudimentary treatments with ether or chloroform, but these methods were risky and not widely available. As a result, many people endured dental pain until the discomfort became unbearable, at which point they sought an extraction as a last resort. The royal court's interest in hygiene and grooming extended to the crafting of specialized tools. It is likely that Queen Victoria's vanity table included elegant toothbrushes made with ivory handles, silver cases for tooth powders, and small crystal bottles for mouth rinses. These items were as much symbols of status as they were tools for health. The ritual of brushing, rinsing, and polishing was not only about maintaining oral health, but also about performing a daily act of refinement and discipline. Reflecting on these practices, it is clear that the Victorian approach to dental care was a blend of tradition and emerging science. While many of their methods seem harsh or ineffective by modern standards, they were an important step toward the comprehensive oral hygiene practices we have today. The introduction of commercial dental products, the growth of professional dentistry, and the cultural emphasis on clean, white teeth all began during this era. When you think about Queen Victoria preparing for a public appearance, perhaps a formal dinner or a portrait sitting it, it's interesting to imagine the effort that went into maintaining her teeth and breath. Without the benefit of modern toothpaste or floss, even the wealthiest Victorians had to rely on careful brushing, abrasive powders, and aromatic rinses to stay present. Would the Queen have marveled at the simplicity of our modern toothbrushes and minty toothpaste? Or would she have viewed them as just another tool in the never-ending pursuit of cleanliness and social grace? By the closing decades of the 19th century, dentistry was undergoing a quiet but significant transformation. The Victorian fascination with cleanliness, refinement, and personal presentation meant that oral hygiene was no longer a purely private matter. It was part of the image a person projected to society. Queen Victoria, as the reigning monarch and an influential figure across the British Empire, played a subtle role in shaping how dental care was viewed. Her habits, as well as those of her family, mirrored the broader shift from makeshift remedies to more specialized care, reflecting the new standards of health and sophistication. Professional dentistry was still relatively young during Victoria's lifetime. Early dentists were often self-trained, but by the 1870s, dental schools and professional associations were emerging in Britain. These institutions sought to distinguish dentistry from the crude extractions performed by barbers or traveling tooth pullers. For the upper classes, this meant a growing availability of treatments beyond simple extractions. Dental cleanings, gold fillings, and porcelain crowns were slowly becoming options, though they were costly and far from comfortable. Pain management remained rudimentary, but the use of chloroform and ether in surgical procedures was beginning to spread into dental practice, offering some relief during extractions. Queen Victoria herself likely had access to the best dental care of her time. Royal dentists, who often had medical training and specialized equipment, would have ensured her teeth were polished, treated, and maintained with the utmost care. Reports from the period suggest that she was conscious of her public image and believed in presenting herself with dignity, which extended to her grooming habits. While daily brushing with boar-bristled toothbrushes and tooth powders would have been her main routine, she also likely received periodic professional cleaning, rare luxury in an era when most people endured decayed or missing teeth without intervention. The Victorian emphasis on appearances meant that having clean, white teeth was increasingly seen as a sign of refinement and good upbringing. For women in particular, a polished smile was associated with beauty, health, and social grace. Tooth powders were marketed as cosmetic aids as much as they were health products. Advertisements promised that regular use would keep teeth white and breath fresh, making one more attractive and respectable. These powders came in decorative tins, often embellished with floral designs or gold accents, making them a fashionable addition to dressing tables. For the royal court, such products were not only practical but also symbolic of sophistication. Yet, the methods themselves were often damaging. The abrasives in tooth powders, chalk, ground pumice, or even brick dust could scrape away enamel with prolonged use. Some powders included questionable additives, like alum or acidic agents, that promised whitening but instead weakened teeth over time. Despite these drawbacks, the Victorians considered them essential. For a woman like Queen Victoria, who maintained an image of composure and elegance, tooth care was less about perfect health and more about avoiding the embarrassment of unsightly teeth or bad breath in public appearances. Mouth rinses also became popular during this period. Many were homemade, consisting of water mixed with vinegar, mint leaves, or a splash of alcohol. Others were purchased from apothecaries, with labels claiming they could purify the breath or invigorate the gums. Some of these rinses contained strong herbal extracts like clove or peppermint, which masked odors but provided little in the way of true antibacterial action. For someone like Queen Victoria, who attended countless audiences, dinners, and state events, maintaining fresh breath would have been an unspoken yet vital part of court etiquette. Dentures, though still imperfect, were becoming more sophisticated as well. Wealthier individuals who had lost several teeth could commission sets of false teeth made from porcelain or ivory. These dentures were often custom crafted and set with metal springs to hold them in place, though they could be uncomfortable and prone to breaking. The use of human teeth, known as Waterloo teeth, after the infamous trade in teeth from battlefields was declining by Victoria's reign, but had not entirely disappeared. For a queen, such measures would have been a last resort, but it shows how far people were willing to go to maintain the appearance of a full, healthy smile. Beyond personal care, the Victorian era marked the beginning of modern dental advertising. Companies that produced toothbrushes and powders began printing colorful ads in newspapers and magazines, often using language that connected dental hygiene with moral character. Clean teeth were portrayed as a reflection of self-discipline, while neglected teeth suggested carelessness or lower-class status. This moral framing resonated with a society that valued order, refinement, and self-improvement. The royal family's adoption of these habits only reinforced their importance. When Queen Victoria or her daughters were seen to promote certain products or habits intentionally or otherwise, it carried weight with the public. For the middle classes, who were eager to emulate aristocratic standards, dental care became a marker of aspiration. Families who could afford it purchased toothbrushes for each member of the household, while those with fewer resources shared a single brush or used simple claws. Tooth powders became common even in modest homes, as they were relatively inexpensive and widely available. By the late 1800s, children were encouraged to brush their teeth, though often not with the same regularity we expect today. In many homes, brushing once a day or even once every few days was considered sufficient. The growing understanding of oral health was partly linked to the broader Victorian obsession with sanitation. Just as cities were investing in sewage systems and clean water to combat disease, individuals were urged to keep their mouths clean as a way of preventing illness. While the science was still incomplete, there was a belief that bad breath or decayed teeth could lead to serious health problems. This idea encouraged people to take better care of their mouths, even if their methods were imperfect. By the time of Queen Victoria's later years, dental care was beginning to look more like a profession than a trade. Dental chairs, specialized tools, and even early drills were being developed, though they were far from the comfortable instruments we know today. Anesthetic techniques were improving, and dentists were starting to focus on preserving teeth rather than simply extracting them. These advancements laid the groundwork for modern dentistry, but for most Victorians, toothaches remained a dreaded and common experience. It is fascinating to consider how the habits of Queen Victoria and her court influenced the broader public. When the monarch was known to value grooming, refinement, and a polished appearance. These values trickled down through society. Tooth care became not just a matter of health, but a reflection of character. To have clean, well-maintained teeth was to show that one was disciplined, modern, and part of the respectable classes. When you imagine Queen Victoria seated at her vanity, gently brushing her teeth with a boar-bristled brush and dabbing her mouth with a mint-infused rinse, you can see the beginnings of our modern oral hygiene culture. Though her methods were rough by today's standards, they represented a turning point, a shift from mere survival and appearance to a more conscious effort to preserve health and maintain social grace. But it leaves an intriguing question. If Queen Victoria had lived to see the invention of modern toothpaste, fluoride treatments, and electric toothbrushes, would she have embraced them with the same dedication? Or would she have viewed our sleek high-tech methods as overindulgent compared to the simple rituals of her time? Imagine stepping into a Victorian drawing room, the air heavy with a blend of floral, musky, and powdery scents. Perfume in the 19th century was not simply about smelling, but was a tool for masking the realities of a time when daily bathing was rare and the urban air was often polluted by coal, smoke-damp streets, and the odors of horse-drawn traffic. Queen Victoria's court, like the rest of high society, relied heavily on fragrances and body powders to maintain an aura of refinement and cleanliness. These products were an essential part of personal care, just as vital as washing, brushing hair, or dressing in layers of silk and lace. The Victorian relationship with scent was deeply tied to social standing. A well-chosen perfume or delicate body powder suggested wealth, sophistication, and good taste. Unlike the harsh, overwhelming fragrances of earlier centuries, Victorian perfumes tended to be lighter and more floral, designed to create a sense of freshness rather than to overpower. Queen Victoria herself preferred soft, natural scents. Rose, violet, orange blossom, and lavender were among her favorites. It is said that her love of flowers extended to her personal toiletries, as she often commissioned fragrances inspired by the gardens of her royal estates. For the average Victorian woman, perfume was more than an accessory. It was part of her identity. Scent was believed to have the power to express personality, evoke memories, and even influence emotions. Perfume houses such as Atkinson's, Penhaligon's, and Grossmith flourished during this time, creating blends tailored to the preferences of the aristocracy and middle class. Many of these fragrances were crafted using natural ingredients: rose petals, jasmine, sandalwood, and bergamot distilled or infused into oils and alcohol bases. Some perfumes even contained exotic materials, like ambergris or musk, sourced through global trade. Body powders were equally important. Before the widespread use of deodorant or frequent bathing, powders helped absorb sweat and reduce unpleasant odors. They were lightly scented with floral or herbal essences and applied to the skin after washing or to undergarments to create a sense of freshness. Women dusted their necks, arms, and with these powders, while men used them to keep their collars and cuffs smelling clean. For formal occasions, a fine layer of powder added a touch of luxury to the overall grooming routine, giving the impression of delicacy and refinement. Queen Victoria's personal grooming table likely featured a collection of perfumes, powders, and scented waters, each chosen for specific occasions. Rose water and elderflower water were common staples, used not only as fragrances, but also as gentle toners for the skin. Lavender water was prized for its soothing properties and was often dabbed on handkerchiefs or gloves. These scented products helped mask the fact that Victorian clothing, with its many layers, was difficult to wash regularly. A woman's corset, chemise, and petticoats might not be laundered as often as modern garments, so perfume and powder became essential tools for maintaining a sense of cleanliness. Interestingly, perfume was not only used on the body, but also on fabrics. It was common for women to scent their gloves, handkerchiefs, and even the hems of their dresses. A faint trail of fragrance was considered elegant and alluring. Queen Victoria herself was known to keep sachets of dried lavender or rose petals among her linens and garments, ensuring that her clothing carried a subtle floral scent. This practice was widespread among the upper classes, who viewed fragrance as a reflection of personal refinement. While perfume was widely loved, it also carried an element of class distinction. The wealthy could afford perfumes made from rare natural ingredients, while the working classes often had to settle for cheaper, harsher scents made with synthetic or diluted oils. Strong or overpowering perfumes were sometimes frowned upon as being too common or gaudy, while light, fresh fragrances were associated with sophistication. Queen Victoria's preference for understated floral notes reflected this ideal of quiet elegance. Perfume also had a practical side beyond masking body odor. In a time when urban air was filled with smoke and unpleasant smells, carrying a scented handkerchief was a way to create a personal bubble of freshness. Both men and women would hold these handkerchiefs to their noses while walking through crowded streets or visiting markets. It was not unusual for fashionable ladies to keep small perfume bottles in their reticules, allowing them to refresh their scent throughout the day. Powders, too, had multiple uses. In addition to being applied to the body, they were used on hair to absorb oil between washes. Cornstarch, ground rice, and fine clay were common ingredients, often mixed with subtle scents. These powders gave hair a cleaner appearance and a soft texture, especially important at a time when washing hair with water and soap was considered both inconvenient and potentially harmful. A well-powdered hairstyle signaled good grooming and attention to detail. The preparation of perfumes and powders was an art form in itself. Skilled perfumers blended natural essences into complex fragrances, while powder makers experimented with textures and scents that would feel smooth on the skin. The packaging of these products was equally important. Glass bottles were often hand-blown and etched with decorative designs, while powders were sold in ornate containers with gilded lids. Owning such items was a mark of wealth and good taste, and they were often displayed on dressing tables as symbols of refinement. For men, fragrance was also important, though the scents tended to be more subdued and woody. Colognes and aftershaves were popular, often incorporating notes of citrus, sandalwood, or vanilla. Gentlemen would apply cologne to their hands and hair, as well as to their cravats and collars. A subtle fragrance was considered part of a well-groomed appearance, especially in social settings. What's striking about the Victorian use of perfumes and powders is how closely it was tied to their concept of cleanliness. While they did not bathe daily, the combination of scented products, frequent changes of underclothes, and careful grooming created the impression of freshness. This reliance on fragrance was not about covering up dirt, but about maintaining a polished and socially acceptable image. Queen Victoria's court, with its emphasis on decorum and propriety, exemplified this attitude. It's worth noting that perfume was also deeply personal. While mass-produced fragrances were becoming common, many women still preferred custom-made scents, blended to suit their individual tastes. A woman's signature fragrance was part of her identity, and it was said that a person's perfume could leave a lasting impression long after they left the room. Queen Victoria herself was so fond of certain floral notes that she often requested perfumes designed specifically for her, ensuring that her scent was unique and distinctive. Thinking about this world of scents and powders, it's easy to see how much importance Victorians placed on the details of presentation. In an age when the realities of hygiene were limited by technology, fragrance offered a way to rise above the everyday and create an air of elegance. But this raises an interesting question. Would the Victorians, with their layers of perfume and powder, have considered our modern obsession with unscented products and clean smells as bland or uninspired? Or would they have been fascinated by our access to endless varieties of perfumes, sprays, and lotions that require so little effort to use? The creation of perfumes during the Victorian era was as much a craft as it was a science. Perfumers worked with a palette of natural ingredients and resins to craft fragrances that would appeal to the refined tastes of the upper and middle classes. The process was labor-intensive, involving distillation, or the end result was often a complex, layered scent that captured the spirit of the age. Romantic, delicate, and evocative of nature. Victorian perfumers relied on a variety of raw materials imported from around the world. Rose and jasmine were favorites for their sweet, timeless aromas, while violet, lily of the valley, and orange blossom added softer notes. Exotic ingredients, such as sandalwood from India, patchouli from Southeast Asia, and ambergris from the Atlantic, gave fragrances depth and richness. Musk, which was often animal-derived, was used sparingly to add warmth to floral compositions. These natural elements reflected the Victorian fascination with gardens, flowers, and the natural world of fascination shared by Queen Victoria herself, who loved the floral scents of her royal gardens. Global trade played a crucial role in shaping Victorian perfumes. The British Empire's reach allowed perfumers to access rare and expensive ingredients that were previously unknown to European consumers. Spices from Ceylon, citrus oils from the Mediterranean, and resins from the Middle East all found their way into British fragrance houses. This exotic influence made perfume not just a luxury item but a symbol of global sophistication. A single bottle of scent might carry ingredients from 3 continents, embodying the empire's wealth and diversity. Perfume was also closely tied to fashion and social customs. It was considered essential for formal occasions, particularly in the royal court. Balls, banquets, and state dinners were gatherings where appearances were everything, and a well-chosen fragrance could leave a lasting impression. Gentle dabs of scent on gloves, handkerchiefs, or the neckline of a gown were seen as tasteful and alluring. For Queen Victoria, who set the tone for aristocratic etiquette, the use of subtle floral perfumes reinforced her image of grace and femininity. Strong, overpowering scents were considered vulgar, while delicate blends of rose or violet suggested elegance and refinement. Body powders were equally important in Victorian daily life, serving both functional and aesthetic purposes. Made from fine starches or clays, these powders absorbed moisture, reduced friction from clothing, and left a light, pleasant fragrance on the skin. Women applied them after bathing or dry washing, focusing on areas like the neck, arms, and chest. The powders were often infused with floral essences. Rose, lavender, and jasmine were popular choices and packaged in decorative boxes or tins. They were also used to scent linens, undergarments, and even hair, acting as an early form of deodorant in an era when modern antiperspirants did not yet exist. For men, body powders were slightly different, typically featuring more subdued scents with woody or citrus notes. Gentlemen would use powder on collars and cuffs to stay fresh during long days spent in heavy wool suits. Barbers also used scented powders after shaving, giving clients a clean, polished finish. The ritual of powdering was a subtle but vital part of personal grooming, especially in high society, where physical appearance was closely tied to social reputation. The production of powders, much like perfumes, required skill and attention to detail. Perfumers and apothecaries carefully blended starches with aromatic oils to create products that were light, silky, and pleasantly fragrant. These powders were sold in ornate containers, often with soft puffs for application. A lady's dressing table was incomplete without a selection of powders, alongside her perfumes and hair oils. Queen Victoria herself would have had access to the finest powders available, likely prepared by trusted court suppliers, who tailored their products to her personal tastes. Victorian advertisements for perfumes and powders often emphasized their connection to health and beauty. Perfume was marketed as a way to refresh the senses, lift the mood, and even ward off miasmas, the foul airs thought to cause disease. Powders, meanwhile, were praised for their ability to keep the skin dry and smooth, preventing irritation from corsets and layered clothing. The language of these advertisements often blended luxury with practicality, promising both refinement and comfort to those who used their products. Interestingly, perfume and powder were also intertwined with Victorian ideas of morality. A well-scented person was seen as disciplined, elegant, and socially conscious. Conversely, neglecting one's personal fragrance was often viewed as a sign of poor upbringing or lack of This moral link to grooming was particularly strong among the middle class, who aspired to the standards set by the aristocracy and royal family. Queen Victoria's preference for light, natural scents reinforced the notion that true refinement was understated rather than ostentatious. Beyond personal use, perfumes and powders played a role in the home. It was common to scent rooms with potpourri sachets or perfumed oils, particularly in spaces where guests would be entertained. Curtains, cushions, and upholstery could hold lingering odors from smoke or cooking, so fragrance was used to maintain a fresh and pleasant atmosphere. Wealthier households often kept bowls of rose petals, lavender, or dried herbs in their drawing rooms, while more affluent families could afford bottled room sprays or specially prepared scented wax tablets. Victorian travel kits also featured miniature perfumes and powders. For women traveling to country estates or social events, carrying a small vial of perfume and a tin of powder was essential. These compact items were tucked into handbags or reticules, ensuring that one could freshen up after a long journey by carriage or train. This attention to scent was not a matter of vanity, but of maintaining the expected social standards of cleanliness and grace. Perfume also carried romantic associations in the Victorian imagination. It was believed that a person's scent could evoke powerful emotions or memories, a concept reflected in literature and poetry of the time. Many Victorian love tokens included scented gloves, handkerchiefs, or letters perfumed with a hint of lavender or rose. The act of exchanging fragrance was intimate and deeply personal, a way of leaving one's presence behind even when physically absent. Despite its popularity, perfume was not universally embraced. Some critics argued that artificial scents were deceptive, hiding the true nature of a person. Others claimed that heavy perfumes were unladylike or associated with questionable morality. These debates reflected broader tensions in Victorian society between naturalness and artifice, modesty and display. Queen Victoria's own choices favoring light, garden-inspired fragrances helped shape the prevailing standard of tasteful perfume use. Looking back at this scented world, it's striking how much effort Victorians put into maintaining an impression of freshness and refinement. Their use of perfumes and powders was not just about masking unpleasant odors, but about creating an atmosphere of elegance, confidence, and social poise. Even in an age when daily bathing was rare, these scented rituals allowed people to feel presentable and dignified. But it raises an interesting question. If a Victorian were transported to our modern world with its wide array of deodorants, body sprays, and perfumes, would they marvel at the convenience and variety? Or would they find our scents overwhelming compared to their subtle floral traditions? By the late 19th century, the use of perfumes and powders had become a cultural ritual, not just for royalty but across the growing middle classes. What began as a necessity to mask odors, in a time of limited bathing, it evolved into an art form and an expression of social refinement. Perfume houses were booming, and the packaging of these products became just as important as the fragrances themselves. Intricate glass bottles with hand-painted details and ornate stoppers lined the dressing tables of Victorian women. Powders were presented in decorative tins and porcelain containers, often adorned with floral motifs or gilded edges, making them both practical and decorative. Queen Victoria's preferences had a direct influence on fragrance trends across Europe. Her love for light, garden-inspired scents shaped public taste, pushing perfume makers to create blends that echoed the freshness of nature rather than the heavy, animal-based fragrances of previous centuries. Perfume houses often promoted their products by claiming that they were fit for royalty, a marketing strategy that suggested their scents were inspired by or even used within the royal court. A simple association with Queen Victoria's name or her gardens at Balmoral or Osborne House could elevate a perfume's prestige. The Victorian era also saw the rise of signature scents, with many women choosing one particular perfume to wear exclusively. A personal scent became a subtle calling card, a way of expressing individuality in a society that often valued uniformity in dress and behavior. A well-chosen fragrance was meant to linger faintly in a room, leaving a delicate impression without being overpowering. This contrasted sharply with earlier centuries, where perfumes were often bold and intense, used to mask the pervasive smells of unwashed bodies and unventilated homes. Body powders continued to be a cornerstone of personal grooming. They were not limited to men, too used powders to keep their skin dry under heavy wool clothing, to maintain freshness while wearing stiff collars and waistcoats. In aristocratic households, powders were often perfumed with lavender or rose oils, while in working-class homes, simpler unscented powders made from plain cornstarch were the norm. Despite the differences in quality, the act of powdering was a shared cultural practice, bridging class divides in a quiet but important way. Hair powders also persisted well into the Victorian era, particularly among women who styled their hair in elaborate fashions. These powders, often made from starch or finely ground rice, absorbed oils and gave hair a softer texture. A light application of scented powder could make hair appear cleaner between washes, which were infrequent due to the complexity of hairstyles and the belief that frequent wetting weakened the scalp. Even Queen Victoria's thick, dark hair would have been maintained with careful brushing and the occasional use of lightly scented powders rather than the frequent shampoos we rely on today. Perfumed gloves were another unique trend of the era. Ladies would scent their gloves with lavender or orange blossom oils, allowing their fragrance to be subtly released with every movement of their hands. This practice not only masked any odors from leather or sweat, but also added a touch of luxury to social interactions. When a woman extended a hand for a greeting, the soft scent from her gloves was considered an elegant detail, a reflection of her refinement. The popularity of perfumes and powders was also intertwined with Victorian ideas about health. Scents like lavender, rose, and peppermint were believed to have therapeutic effects, calming the mind or invigorating the senses. Some fragrances were marketed as restorative, claiming to improve mood or protect against airborne illnesses. While these claims were often exaggerated, they reveal how Victorians saw fragrance as more than mere decoration, was part of a holistic approach to well-being. As the century progressed, advances in chemistry allowed perfumers to experiment with synthetic ingredients. This made fragrances more affordable and consistent. As natural flower essences were expensive and labor-intensive to produce, however, the elite often looked down on synthetic perfumes, considering them inferior to the authentic floral oils used in high-end fragrances. Queen Victoria's preference for natural, garden-inspired scents kept traditional methods alive, encouraging perfume houses to continue crafting blends from real botanical sources. Powders, too, began to diversify in composition and purpose. Some were designed specifically for the face, creating a matte, porcelain-like complexion that was highly fashionable at the time. These face powders were often pale in color, aligning with the Victorian ideal that fair, unblemished skin represented beauty and social status. While some face powders contained harmful ingredients like lead or arsenic, those intended for royalty or the wealthy were typically made with safer ingredients such as rice powder or fine clay. Queen Victoria, who valued modesty and simplicity, likely favored more natural products that enhanced her complexion without looking overly artificial. The cultural symbolism of scent was especially powerful in the Victorian court. Perfume was not just a luxury, it was a statement of identity and refinement. To wear the wrong kind of scent or to apply too much was seen as a breach of etiquette. The correct fragrance should complement one's personality and attire, never overwhelming those nearby. Queen Victoria's own choices, which leaned toward gentle floral notes, set the tone for proper fragrance etiquette among the aristocracy, and eventually the aspiring middle classes. The combination of perfumes and powders helped create the illusion of freshness in a world where daily washing was rare. A Victorian woman might go several days without bathing but would still appear and smell clean by the standards of her time, thanks to careful grooming, fragrant soaps, and a dusting of scented powder. In this way, perfumes and powders became essential tools for navigating the strict social expectations of Victorian society, where appearances were everything. Interestingly, perfumes and powders were also linked to memory and sentimentality. It was common for perfumes to be given as gifts between lovers, or for handkerchiefs to be perfumed with a signature scent before being exchanged. A fragrance could evoke a memory of a person or place, creating an invisible connection between individuals. For Queen Victoria, who was famously devoted to Prince Albert, certain floral scents were likely associated with personal moments, such as walks through the gardens of their beloved estates. As the Victorian era came to a close, the influence of perfumes and powders did not wane. Instead, they became part of the foundation of the modern beauty and grooming industries. Many of the iconic perfume houses that began during this period, many of which trace their origins back to Victorian tastes. Likewise, the tradition of dusting powders evolved into the cosmetic powders and talcs that remain staples in modern beauty routines. Looking back, it is fascinating to see how something as simple as a fragrance or a fine layer of powder could carry such cultural weight. These products were not merely practical. They were expressions of elegance, health, and social class. In an age where true cleanliness was difficult to maintain, they filled the gap between reality and the ideal image of refinement. Yet one question lingers. Would a Victorian aristocrat stepping into a modern world where daily showers and unscented lotions are common find our approach to grooming oddly clinical? Would they miss the artistry and ritual of powders, sachets, and hand-blended perfumes? Or would they marvel at the ease with which we achieve a level of freshness they once could only create through elaborate, scented layers? When you think of Victorian palaces, the first images that come to mind are often of opulence, grand ballrooms, ornate chandeliers, and gilded mirrors. But beneath all that splendor lay the reality of hygiene, or, more accurately, the lack of it by modern standards. Cleanliness, while valued, was limited by the technology and medical knowledge of the time. This contrast was especially striking when compared to Victorian hospitals, which were undergoing a slow but crucial transformation in their approach to sanitation and patient care. While the wealthy enjoyed certain comforts, the standards of hygiene in both palaces and hospitals were far from what we would expect today. In the early 19th century, Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle were not the pristine, sparkling residences we imagine today. Though they were staffed by dozens of servants responsible for cleaning, the very design of these buildings made them difficult to maintain. Rooms were heated with coal fires, leaving a fine layer of soot on surfaces. Heavy drapes and carpets, which were rarely washed, absorbed dust and odors. Chamber pots were a common feature in royal apartments before the widespread introduction of indoor plumbing, and it was the servants' job to empty and clean them each morning. The smell of smoke, dampness, and human waste would have lingered, despite the best efforts of the household staff. Queen Victoria, however, was known to be particular about the cleanliness of her. Under her reign, efforts were made to modernize the royal residences. Prince Albert, in particular, was a driving force behind these changes. He believed strongly in the connection between cleanliness and health, and he supported the introduction of improved ventilation, plumbing, and sewage systems in royal homes. By the mid to late 19th century, Buckingham Palace had begun installing indoor bathrooms, a luxury that very few people in Britain had at the time. These bathrooms featured rudimentary flush toilets, porcelain basins, and large tubs with taps for hot and cold water, a revolutionary convenience for the age. Still, daily bathing was not the norm, even for royalty. The process of filling a tub required multiple servants who had to carry buckets of heated water to the bathroom. Because of this, full baths were usually reserved for once or twice a week, while sponge baths and scented cloths were used for daily freshening. Rose water, lavender water, and other scented rinses were common, helping to mask any lingering odors from unwashed clothing or the palace's musty atmosphere. The situation in hospitals during Queen Victoria's time was far less refined. Before the reforms of Florence Nightingale and others, hospitals were often overcrowded, dirty, and poorly ventilated. Patients were crammed into wards where infections spread and doctors operated with little understanding of germs or the need for sterilization. It was common for surgical instruments to be reused without proper cleaning, and doctors moved from one patient to another without washing their hands. The concept of antiseptic treatment was virtually unknown until the latter half of the century. Florence Nightingale's work during the Crimean War brought public attention to the importance of hygiene in medical settings. She insisted on clean bedding, proper ventilation, and hand washing, significantly reducing infection rates among wounded soldiers. Her findings had a profound impact on British hospitals, leading to widespread reforms. The adoption of Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods in the 1860s further revolutionized medicine. Carbolic acid was introduced to clean surgical instruments and wounds, and the idea of sterilization slowly became standard practice. Queen Victoria herself played a small but significant role in this transformation. She awarded Florence Nightingale with honors and supported efforts to improve sanitation in both military and civilian hospitals. The Queen's own childbirth experiences also highlighted the need for better hygiene and medical care. When she gave birth to her children, she benefited from more advanced practices than most women of her time. But even royal births were not free of risks. The use of chloroform as anesthesia during her 8th delivering in 1853 made headlines and helped normalize its use, signaling a growing acceptance of medical advancements in both pain relief and hygiene. Despite these improvements, Victorian hospitals remained places of discomfort for most patients. Even with cleaner wards and better sanitation, the lack of antibiotics meant that infections were still common and often deadly. Wealthier families, including the aristocracy, often preferred to be treated at home rather than in a hospital, believing that the privacy and cleanliness of their own residence was superior to public institutions. This divide between hospital hygiene and palace hygiene reveals the stark contrasts of the Victorian age. While royalty and the wealthy had access to perfumes, powders, and the latest plumbing innovations, the poor often faced a grim reality of limited access to clean water, overcrowded living conditions, and inadequate medical care. Public health reforms, such as the construction of modern sewer systems and the provision of clean water, were critical in improving conditions for the general population. Prince Albert was a vocal supporter of these efforts, believing that public health was essential for the progress of the nation. Within the royal residences, hygiene extended beyond bathing and cleaning. The kitchens and dining areas were also subject to careful management. Food safety was a growing concern, as outbreaks of foodborne illness were not uncommon. The palace kitchens employed strict routines to ensure that meat and produce were fresh, and the use of ice houses helped preserve food in the days before refrigeration. Still, even with these precautions, the standards of Victorian food storage would seem primitive by modern standards. The palace staff played a crucial role in maintaining hygiene. Hundreds of servants were employed to handle cleaning, laundry, and other tasks that kept the royal family and their guests comfortable. Linens were washed more frequently than outer garments, which were typically brushed and aired out rather than fully laundered. The sheer volume of clothing, bedding, and household textiles meant that the palace laundry was a massive operation, with teams of laundresses working tirelessly to keep everything fresh. In hospitals, by contrast, linens were often reused until they were heavily soiled, and cleaning standards varied widely. Nightingale's reforms emphasized the importance of fresh bedding and proper laundry facilities, which became a cornerstone of modern hospital care. The stark differences between the pristine image of the royal court and the harsh realities of Victorian hospitals illustrate how uneven access to hygiene was during this period. What's fascinating is how both palaces and hospitals became symbols of progress as hygiene practices improved. In the royal residences, the installation of modern bathrooms and plumbing represented a new era of luxury and convenience. In hospitals, the adoption of sanitation measures and antiseptics marked the beginning of modern medical science. Both were part of the broader Victorian belief that cleanliness, order, and technology were keys to advancing society. As you picture Buckingham Palace in the mid-1800s, with its polished marble floors, servants bustling about, and the faint scent of rosewater lingering in the halls. It is easy to forget that the standards of hygiene we take for granted today were only just beginning to take shape. Similarly, when you imagine a Victorian hospital ward, with rows of iron beds and patients recovering under the watchful eyes of nurses trained by Nightingale's methods, you can see the beginnings of a revolution in medical care. But it leaves us with a question. How much of the Victorian obsession with appearances, be it the polished floors of the palace or the pristine linens of the hospital, was about true cleanliness? And how much was about creating an image of order and control in a world that was still learning how to combat the unseen dangers of infection? As the 19th century progressed, hygiene practices in both palaces and hospitals underwent remarkable changes, spurred by technological advances and a growing understanding of health. In the royal residences, plumbing and sanitation evolved from basic, labor-intensive methods to something closer to what we would recognize today. At the same time, Victorian hospitals were slowly adopting scientific principles that would lay the foundation for modern medicine. In the early part of Queen Victoria's reign, bathrooms were a rare luxury, even in royal households. At Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, bathing was still a cumbersome affair that required large amounts of manual labor. Servants had to heat water over fires, carry it in buckets, and pour it into a portable tin or copper tub. This process could take hours, and as a result, full-body bathing remained infrequent. To freshen up between baths, the Queen and her family relied on sponge bath, rose water, and scented cloths, as well as the use of perfumes and powders to maintain the impression of cleanliness. Prince Albert's influence on the modernization of royal hygiene cannot be overstated. A keen advocate for technological progress, he pushed for the installation of improved plumbing systems in the royal residences. By the mid-1850s, several of the Queen's homes were equipped with running water, making it easier to fill baths and clean linens. Albert was also instrumental in introducing flush toilets, a relatively new invention at the time. Early versions of these toilets, though basic by today's standards, represented a massive leap forward from chamber pots, which required manual emptying by servants. The introduction of bathrooms in the palace was accompanied by advances in heating systems. Hot water was increasingly available through early water boilers, reducing the reliance on kettles and making bathing a less laborious task. By the later years of Victoria's reign, Buckingham Palace and other royal residences boasted several dedicated bathrooms, complete with porcelain tubs, tiled walls, and decorative fixtures. These bathrooms were designed not only for functionality, but also to reflect the luxury expected of a royal household. While the royal family enjoyed these comforts, the general public lagged far behind. Most homes, even among the middle class, lacked indoor plumbing until the late 19th century. Families shared basins of cold water for daily washing, and full baths were often limited to once a week or less. The idea of a dedicated bathroom with running water was still considered a mark of wealth, and public bathhouses were the main source of bathing facilities. For the working class, the stark contrast between the palace and the average home highlighted the vast social divide of Victorian Britain. Hospitals, meanwhile, were undergoing a transformation of their own. The mid-19th century was a turning point in the history of medical care. The pioneering work of Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War had demonstrated the critical role of cleanliness in preventing disease. Her insistence on washing hands, sterilizing bedding, and improving ventilation saved countless lives and set new standards for hospital hygiene. Nightingale's influence extended beyond military hospitals. She helped reform civilian medical institutions as well, advocating for better training of nurses and the design of hospital wards to reduce infection. Joseph Lister's development of antiseptic techniques in the 1860s further revolutionized hospital hygiene. Lister's discovery that carbolic acid could be used to sterilize surgical instruments and wounds dramatically reduced post-surgical infections. His work was initially met with skepticism, but as evidence of its effectiveness mounted, antiseptic practices began to spread across Britain and beyond. By the late Victorian era, many hospitals were adopting carbolic sprays, sterilized instruments, and cleaner surgical environments, marking a clear departure from the unsanitary conditions of earlier decades. Queen Victoria herself played a symbolic role in the acceptance of modern medical practices. When she gave birth to Prince Leopold in 1853, she famously used chloroform for pain relief or decision. It was both controversial and groundbreaking. Her endorsement of medical advancements helped normalize their use among the public. Similarly, her support for Nightingale and other reformers gave legitimacy to the growing movement for improved sanitation in hospitals. The royal palaces were not only adopting these modern conveniences for personal hygiene, but also serving as showcases of technological progress. Prince Albert was known for his interest in engineering and design, and he encouraged the use of cutting-edge plumbing and sanitation systems in royal residences. For example, the installation of flush toilets at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight was considered a novelty, and guests often remarked on the comfort and convenience of the palace's facilities. These improvements mirrored the broader push for better sanitation across Britain, including the construction of modern sewer systems and public water supplies in cities. Palace kitchens and food preparation areas were also subject to increased scrutiny during Victoria's reign, with large banquets and daily meals for the royal family. Maintaining hygiene in the kitchen was essential. Food was stored in ice houses or cool cellars, and staff were expected to keep cooking areas meticulously clean. While refrigeration as we know it did not exist, ice blocks were used to preserve meat and dairy products. Even so, Victorian food safety standards were rudimentary, and foodborne illnesses were not uncommon. The palace's efforts to maintain cleanliness in its kitchens were ahead of their time, reflecting the Queen's desire for order and efficiency. Laundry was another key aspect of hygiene in the palace, with the royal family and hundreds of staff members wearing multiple layers of clothing each day. The volume of laundry was immense. Linens, undergarments, and towels were washed more frequently than outer garments, which were often brushed and aired rather than fully laundered. The palace employed teams of laundresses who worked long hours, boiling, scrubbing, and ironing fabrics. While this process was labor-intensive, it was considered essential for maintaining the royal image of cleanliness and refinement in hospitals. Similar changes were taking place, though on a much more functional level. The importance of clean bedding, sterilized instruments, and proper ventilation became widely recognized. Thanks to Nightingale's efforts, hospitals began to separate wards based on the type of illness, and infection control became a priority. Though resources were often limited, these reforms marked the beginning of the modern hospital system. By the end of the 19th century, hospitals in major cities like London were far cleaner and safer than they had been in Victoria's early years. The Victorian era's obsession with order and cleanliness extended beyond practical hygiene. It was tied to a larger cultural belief that cleanliness reflected morality, discipline, and social status. A clean home or hospital was seen as a sign of progress and civilization, while dirt and disorder were associated with backwardness or moral failings. This mindset influenced not only the way people bathed or washed, but also how cities were designed, how waste was managed, and how public health policies were shaped. Looking at the differences between Victorian hospitals and royal palaces, one can see two sides of the same coin. Both were deeply concerned with appearances and order, but for different reasons. In the palace, hygiene was about maintaining an image of refinement and luxury. In the hospital, it was about survival, reducing infections, and giving patients a better chance to recover. Yet both settings benefited from the same technological and scientific advances: better plumbing, improved cleaning techniques, and a growing understanding of the link between sanitation and health. These changes raise an interesting question. How many of Victorian hygiene practices were genuinely effective, and how many were rituals designed to give the impression of cleanliness? While flushing toilets, antiseptic sprays, and clean linens undoubtedly improved conditions, many habits such as the liberal use of perfumes and powders were more about appearances than true sanitation. And yet, these practices laid the foundation for the modern standards of hygiene we now take for granted. By the end of Queen Victoria's reign in 1901, the evolution of hygiene practices in both palaces and hospitals had transformed not only these institutions, but also public attitudes toward cleanliness. What began as a slow and inconsistent set of practices largely focused on appearances had become a structured approach to sanitation, deeply tied to health, technology, and even morality. Both the royal residences and the country's medical institutions played significant roles in shaping what modern society now considers basic hygiene. In the royal palaces, the final decades of the 19th century brought the culmination of many improvements that Prince Albert had initiated. Indoor bathrooms were no longer rare luxuries, but standard features within the royal residences, particularly in Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. By the 80s and 1890s, these bathrooms were equipped with porcelain fixtures, elegant taps, and modern sewage connections that carried waste away from the building, an enormous improvement over the chamber pots and night soil arrangements of earlier years. The royal family, though still not bathing daily, now had the means to bathe much more frequently and in greater comfort. These advancements were not just for the royals themselves, but for their numerous guests and staff. Buckingham Palace, with its hundreds of servants, required a complex system of cleaning, laundering, and waste disposal to maintain a level of hygiene befitting its status. This included extensive laundry facilities, staffed by teams who washed and pressed linens, towels, and undergarments daily. Outer garments were still treated differently, often brushed and aired, instead of being laundered due to the delicate nature of the fabrics. Even so, the sheer volume of textiles processed by the palace each week was staggering. The kitchens of the royal residences were also undergoing modernization. By the late Victorian era, new kitchen equipment such as large cast-iron stoves, better ventilation systems, and improved food storage areas was becoming standard. The growing awareness of food hygiene spurred by public health campaigns and scientific advancements meant that palace chefs and kitchen staff were expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness. Food was often stored in ice houses, and meat and fish were delivered fresh daily to ensure quality, while refrigeration, as we know it today, did not yet exist. The combination of fresh deliveries and ice storage helped reduce the risk of foodborne illnesses. In contrast, hospitals were evolving in a way that focused almost entirely on health rather than luxury. The lessons learned from Florence Nightingale's work during the Crimean War and the antiseptic revolution led by Joseph Lister were becoming ingrained in hospital design and operations. By the 1880s, new hospital wards were being built with large windows for ventilation, tiled walls that could be easily cleaned, and dedicated facilities for sterilizing surgical instruments. These reforms drastically reduced infection rates and improved patient outcome. Though challenges remained, particularly in poorer regions and underfunded hospitals, Queen Victoria herself publicly supported these advancements. Her acknowledgement of Florence Nightingale's work lent royal endorsement to the movement for sanitary reform. This support was not purely symbolic. As industrial cities grew, the spread of diseases such as cholera highlighted the urgent need for better public health measures. The royal family's interest in hygiene helped influence the construction of cleaner streets, modern sewers, and public bathhouses, which benefited the general population. Public health policies in late Victorian Britain increasingly reflected the values of cleanliness and order championed by reformers in the monarchy. The Public Health Act of 1875, for example, set new standards for urban sanitation, requiring local authorities to ensure proper drainage, clean water supplies, and regular waste collection. These measures, while primarily aimed at preventing disease outbreaks, also encouraged everyday citizens to adopt cleaner habits. For the middle classes, this meant installing indoor wash basins and using soap more frequently. For the working classes, public baths and laundries offered affordable ways to maintain personal hygiene inside hospitals. The role of nurses expanded significantly during this time, inspired by Nightingale's example. Nurses were trained to keep wards spotless, change linens regularly, and ensure that patients were bathed and cared for in a clean environment. These practices were revolutionary in a time when hospital infections were once considered an unavoidable risk. By enforcing standards of cleanliness, nurses became the guardians of a new approach to patient care, one that emphasized prevention as much as treatment. Palaces and hospitals alike reflected a broader cultural belief that cleanliness was synonymous with progress. To be clean was to be modern, civilized, and morally upright. This belief extended to every aspect of Victorian life. From personal grooming to city planning, streets were paved and regularly swept, water supplies were filtered and improved, and homes were increasingly equipped with facilities for washing and waste removal. Even the language of advertising during this era emphasized the connection between hygiene and character. Soap companies, for instance, marketed their products not just as cleaning agents, but as symbols of respectability and moral integrity. It's fascinating to consider how the royal family's habits influenced these trends. When Queen Victoria embraced certain practices, as using mild soaps, rose water, or even modern conveniences like flush toilet sit, set a standard for the aristocracy and middle classes to follow. While most working-class families could not afford such luxuries, they aspired to them. Public bathhouses, which began as utilitarian facilities, were often designed with decorative touches to make them feel more refined, echoing the aesthetics of private bathrooms in wealthy homes. The Victorian obsession with cleanliness was not without its contradictions. While great strides were made in sanitation, some practices were still based on outdated beliefs. For instance, while germ theory was becoming widely accepted by the late 19th century, many people still believed that foul smells themselves caused disease. As a result, heavy perfumes, floral waters, and scented powders were often used to create the impression of freshness, even in spaces that might not have been truly clean. In hospitals, the adoption of antiseptics was a critical turning point, but it was not universally embraced at first. Some doctors resisted Lister's methods, believing that the traditional approach of quick and dirty surgery was sufficient. However, as survival rates improved with antiseptic practices, resistance gave way to acceptance. By the end of the century, sterilized instruments, hand-washing protocols, and clean surgical environments were becoming standard across Britain's major hospitals. By the late Victorian period, both hospitals and palaces had become symbols of this new age of cleanliness and order. The royal residences showcased modern plumbing, efficient cleaning systems, and the careful grooming rituals of the Queen and her court. Hospitals, though less luxurious, demonstrated the power of hygiene to save lives and reduce suffering. Together, these institutions reflected a society that was beginning to understand the importance of both personal and public health. As we look back on this era, it is remarkable to see how much of what we consider essential hygiene today was shaped by Victorian values and innovations. From the flush toilet to antiseptic surgery, many of the practices we now take for granted were born in this period of intense social and scientific change. But it leaves an interesting question. Would the Victorians, with their rose-scented cloths and ritualistic cleaning routines, recognize our modern world of instant hot showers, antibacterial gels, and sterilized hospitals as the fulfillment of their ideal Zor? Would they see it as the loss of a certain ceremonial elegance that once made cleanliness feel like an art? When we think about Victorian hygiene, it's easy to focus on bathing and perfumes. But one of the most labor-intensive and essential aspects of cleanliness was laundry. In an age of heavy fabrics, layered clothing, and coal-dusted cities, keeping garments and linens fresh was an enormous task. Unlike modern households, which rely on washing machines and detergent, Victorian families, especially the wealthy, depended on an entire army of laundresses, housemaids, and servants to tackle the daunting task of keeping clothing presentable. For the working classes, the process was just as demanding, though carried out in far more modest conditions, often with little more than a metal washtub, a wooden washboard, and a bar of rough soap. Clothing hygiene in the 19th century was deeply tied to social status. A well-dressed individual was not only judged by the quality of their fabrics, but also by the freshness of their appearance, since outer garments like dresses, coats, and waistcoats were expensive and difficult to clean. Victorians relied heavily on layers of undergarments to protect them from sweat and body oils. Chemises, corset covers, undershirts, drawers, and petticoats were all designed to act as barriers, absorbing dirt and sweat, while keeping the outer layers cleaner for longer. These underclothes were washed frequently, often weekly, while instead being brushed, aired, and spot cleaned to maintain their appearance. The royal household had a particularly intricate laundry operation. Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle employed entire teams of laundresses, each responsible for sorting, soaking, boiling, scrubbing, and ironing the family's endless supply of linens and undergarments. Queen Victoria herself was known for her preference for white cotton underclothes, which required meticulous care to keep spotless. White fabrics were seen as a sign of wealth and refinement. Since maintaining their brightness required both time and resources, laundry was often boiled with harsh lye soap or soda ash to remove stains, then beaten or scrubbed on washboards before being rinsed and hung to dry. The process was physically demanding, with laundresses working long hours in hot, steamy conditions. For the working classes, laundry was often a weekly ordeal, referred to as washing day. This day, usually Monday, was dreaded because of the sheer labor involved. Water had to be fetched from pumps or wells, heated over open fires, and poured into large tubs. Stubborn stains were scrubbed with carbolic or household soap. Clothes were wrung out by hand or with wooden rollers, then hung on lines outdoors or indoors near the hearth. Ironing, done with heavy casting irons heated on stoves, was an additional chore that could take hours. The smell of soap, smoke, and damp fabrics was a familiar part of any Victorian household on laundry day. Queen Victoria's court also relied on the careful airing and pressing of garments between washes. Outer dresses, suits, and uniforms were often cleaned, using a combination of brushing and sponging, a method where stains were dabbed with water or alcohol-based solutions to lift dirt without soaking the fabric. This was especially important for gowns made of silk, velvet, or wool, which could be easily damaged by harsh washing methods. In addition, garments were stored with sachets of lavender, rose petals, or cedar chips to keep them smelling fresh and to deter moths and other pests. The sheer volume of textiles in a Victorian household was staggering. Bedding alone required constant attention. Sheets, pillowcases, and nightgowns had to be washed regularly, while blankets and heavy quilts were beaten, aired, and occasionally brushed with vinegar solutions to remove odors. In the royal palaces, where multiple bedrooms and guest chambers needed to be maintained, the laundry workload was immense. Servants worked in shifts to ensure that fresh linens were always available for the Queen and her guests. One of the most challenging aspects of Victorian laundry was dealing with the delicate trims and embellishments common in fashion. Lace, ribbons, and embroidery required special care and were often removed before washing and reattached afterward. Starching was also an important step for collars, cuffs, and petticoats, as it helped clothing maintain its crisp shape. Starch was made from boiling water, mixed with flour or cornstarch, creating a thick paste that could be applied to fabric. Once dried and ironed, starched garments had a stiff, polished appearance that was highly valued. The smell of laundry was another important consideration. In an age before synthetic detergents, Victorians relied on natural scents to give their clothing a pleasant aroma. Lavender water, rose water, or even drops of essential oils were added to the final rinse or sprinkled on linens before ironing. This practice was especially common in the royal household, where the faint scent of flowers was considered a mark of refinement. Queen Victoria's preference for subtle floral fragrances extended not only to her perfumes, but also to the scent of her clothing and bed linens. The working classes, however, often had to make do with simpler solutions. Soap was expensive, especially before the repeal of the soap tax in 1853, so it was used sparingly. Many families made their own soap from animal fat and lye, a process that was smelly and hazardous, but Homemade soap was rough and lacked the pleasant sense of commercially produced varieties. But it got the job done. For whitening laundry, bluing agents made from powdered indigo or synthetic dyes were used to counteract the yellowing of white fabrics. This gave clothes a crisp, clean look, even if they weren't perfectly spotless. Laundry was not just a chore, but a social event. In some communities, women would gather at washhouses or riverbanks to scrub clothes together, sharing news and gossip as they worked. In urban areas, commercial laundries began to emerge, offering washing and ironing services for those who could afford to outsource the work. Even so, most Victorian households, especially those of the working and middle classes, did their laundry in-house, often devoting an entire day to the task. For the royal family, the management of clothing hygiene extended beyond the palace walls. Traveling with the queen required a small army of attendants to ensure that her wardrobe was maintained. Special traveling chests were packed with clean underclothes, gowns, and linens, and a team of laundresses accompanied the royal party to handle washing on the road. This attention to detail was necessary to preserve the image of the monarchy as refined, orderly, and above the grime of daily life. Thinking about the Victorian approach to laundry, it's remarkable to consider how much effort went into maintaining clothing compared to today. Modern washing machines, detergents, and dryers have reduced what was once an all-day, physically demanding task into something that can be completed in an hour with the push of a button. For Victorians, however, laundry was not just a chore, it was a reflection of one's character and status. A household with crisp linens and fresh-smelling clothes was seen as respectable and well-run. This focus on clothing hygiene also raises an interesting question. Would Victorians who valued the ritual of washing and scenting each garment have seen our modern methods as efficient but lacking in refinement? Or would they have marveled at the convenience of a world where laundry no longer required a day of back-breaking labor, soot-stained water, and hours spent beside a roaring fire? In the Victorian household, the process of maintaining clothing extended well beyond washing. Ironing, brushing, and careful storage were equally important steps in ensuring that garments looked crisp and fresh. For the wealthy, clothing was an investment. Fine dresses, tailored suits, and uniforms were often handmade and took weeks or even months to create. As such, great care was taken to keep these garments in the best possible condition. Ironing alone was an arduous process, requiring strength, patience, and a keen eye for detail. Victorian irons were nothing like the lightweight, electric models we know today. Instead, they were heavy blocks of cast iron with a handle on top. These irons, often weighing 5 to 15 pounds, had to be heated on a stove or over an open fire. The laundress would test the temperature by sprinkling water on the iron. If it sizzled, the iron was ready. This required constant attention, as the iron would cool quickly and need to be reheated. Some households owned multiple irons, allowing one to heat while another was in use. The task was exhausting, especially when pressing stiff fabrics, pleats, or starched collars and cuffs. Starching played a significant role in Victorian laundry. Stiff, crisp clothing was considered a sign of neatness and respectability. Collars, cuffs, and petticoats were treated with starch to help them hold their shape. The starch itself was made from flour, rice, or cornstarch, mixed with water and boiled into a smooth paste. For delicate garments, a light starching provided structure without making the fabric too rigid. In wealthier homes, starch was often scented with rosewater or lavender, giving freshly ironed garments a subtle fragrance. Starched clothing required careful handling too. Much starch made garments uncomfortable and prone to cracking, while too little failed to achieve the desired polished look. Brushing was another key element of clothing care, especially for garments that couldn't be washed frequently. Wool coats, velvet dresses, and fine suits were rarely immersed in water because of the risk of shrinking or damaging the fabric. Instead, they were brushed daily with soft clothes brushes to remove dust, lint, and soot. This was particularly important in urban areas, where coal smoke from factories and chimneys left a fine layer of grime on everything. A well-maintained garment, free of visible dust or stains, was a point of pride and a marker of one's social standing. Spot cleaning techniques were also widely used. Stains were treated with vinegar, lemon juice, or a mix of alcohol and water, depending on the fabric and type of stain. Grease stains were dabbed with chalk powder or breadcrumbs to absorb the oil before brushing it off. Delicate fabrics like silk required special care, often being cleaned by professional silk cleaners rather than at home. Queen Victoria's wardrobe, which included luxurious gowns made of silk, satin, and lace, would have been maintained by skilled attendants who understood these techniques. Clothing maintenance extended to storage practices. Garments were carefully folded or hung to avoid wrinkles and damage. Cedar wood or lavender sachets were placed among clothing to deter moths, which were a constant threat to wool and other natural fibers. In royal households, clothing was stored in large wooden wardrobes or trunks, with each item meticulously labeled and arranged. Traveling with clothing required an additional layer of organization. Special wardrobe trunks were designed to keep garments from creasing during long carriage or train journeys. Laundry for the royal family was an operation of remarkable scale and precision. Buckingham Palace, for instance, had entire rooms dedicated to washing and ironing. Linen from multiple residences, sheets, napkins, undergarments, and towels was sorted, marked, and sent to be boiled, scrubbed, and pressed. Each item had to be returned in perfect condition. For outer garments, palace attendants performed daily inspections, brushing and airing each piece. Servants also maintained the queen's gloves, which were made from delicate kid leather and required hand cleaning with fine powders to prevent staining or discoloration. For the working classes, the approach to clothing hygiene was more pragmatic, but no less time-consuming. Laundry day was often the hardest day of the week, and it was common for women to spend the entire day washing, wringing, and hanging clothes to dry. Ironing was usually done the following day. Once everything had dried, without the help of servants or mechanical tools, these tasks were physically demanding. Hands became rough and cracked from exposure to hot water, lye soap, and scrubbing boards. Even with all the effort, many garments never achieved the bright, crisp look of upper-class clothing, simply because cheaper fabrics were harder to maintain. By the late 19th century, mechanical innovations began to ease some of these burdens. Early hand-cranked washing machines, featuring rotating drums or paddles, were introduced for household use. While still far from automatic, these devices reduced the need for heavy scrubbing. Similarly, wringers with turning rollers allowed water to be squeezed from fabrics more efficiently than by hand. However, these tools were expensive and often confined to wealthier homes or commercial laundries. The working class continued to rely on traditional methods for much of Victoria's reign. Soap production also played an important role in laundry practices. Before the repeal of the soap tax in 1853, soap was expensive and used sparingly. After the tax was lifted, industrial soap manufacturers like Lever Brothers began producing cheaper, better quality soaps for mass use. Sunlight soap, introduced in the late 1880s, was one of the first branded laundry soaps and quickly became popular among both middle-class and working-class households. The availability of affordable soap made regular laundering more achievable, though it was still far from easy. Laundry was not just about hygiene, it was also tied to social expectations and personal pride. A well-kept home, with clean linens and neatly pressed garments, was seen as a reflection of a family's values and respectability. Women, in particular, were judged by their ability to maintain an orderly household. In Queen Victoria's own writings, she often mentioned the importance of domestic order and neatness, traits that became hallmarks of the Victorian ideal of womanhood. The royal family's standards for laundry and clothing care set a precedent that many aspired to, but few could match. The Queen's preference for crisp, white linens and spotless undergarments required an enormous amount of labor from her household staff. Laundresses at the palace were expected to deliver flawless results, often working through the night to prepare clothing for state events or formal dinners. Any mistake a scorched sheet, a torn lace trim was considered unacceptable. Looking back, it is astonishing to think of how much time and effort Victorians devoted to the maintenance of clothing, while modern washing machines and steam irons have reduced laundry to a routine chore. The Victorians treated it as a complex, almost ceremonial process. Every step, from boiling and starching to brushing and scenting, was carefully planned to maintain the appearance of cleanliness and refinement. This meticulous attention to clothing hygiene leads to an intriguing question. If a Victorian laundress were transported to a modern laundry room with its machines, detergents, and fabric softeners, would she marvel at the ease of our methods, or would she see something lacking in the care and artistry that once went into every freshly pressed shirt and perfectly starched collar? By the late 19th century, laundry practices had become deeply woven into the daily rhythms of Victorian life, shaping not just household routines, but also how people dressed and interacted socially. Clothing hygiene, in many ways, dictated Victorian fashion trends. The sheer labor involved in maintaining garments influenced everything from fabric choices to wardrobe planning. Seasonal wardrobes were a hallmark of the era, with lighter cottons and linens reserved for summer, while heavy wools and velvets were worn in winter. Each season brought its own challenges for laundry and storage, as every garment required different methods of care to preserve its appearance. In wealthy households, seasonal clothing was carefully rotated. When summer gave way to autumn, lighter dresses and suits were brushed, aired, and packed away in wooden trunks lined with paper or fabric. Lavender sachets, cedarwood shavings, or dried rose petals were often tucked between layers of clothing to deter moths and add a pleasant scent. Delicate fabrics, such as lace and silk, were wrapped in muslin or tissue to prevent yellowing or damage from light. This attention to storage ensured that garments would look fresh when brought out the following year, and it reflected the Victorian obsession with maintaining appearances. For the royal family, the management of seasonal wardrobe was a monumental task. Queen Victoria's extensive collection of dresses, each designed for specific occasions, seasons, and levels of formality, required a dedicated team of attendants to maintain. Court dress regulations were strict, and gowns often featured intricate trims, beadwork, and embroidery that demanded careful handling. These garments were not laundered in the traditional sense, but instead refreshed through brushing, steaming, and attendants used soft brushes to remove dust, while delicate fabrics were aired in open courtyards or near windows to release any lingering odors. Outerwear such as coats and capes posed additional challenges. Wool garments were prone to retaining smells from coal smoke and the outdoors, so they were hung in ventilated areas and occasionally sprinkled with vinegar solutions to neutralize odors. Some garments were gently sponged with diluted soap and water, though this was done sparingly to avoid shrinking or damaging the fibers. It was common for servants to spend entire days maintaining a single piece of clothing, ensuring it was pristine for the Queen's appearances. Among the middle and working classes, seasonal wardrobes were more limited but still maintained with care. A few key garments, such as a best Sunday dress or a well-made winter coat, were treated with particular attention. These items were rarely worn during daily work and were carefully cleaned and stored between uses. The Sunday best tradition, where families wore their cleanest and finest clothes to church, was as much about hygiene as it was about respectability. Clean, well-kept clothing was seen as a reflection of a person's character and morality, and failing to appear tidy in public could be socially damaging. One fascinating aspect of Victorian laundry was the treatment of special fabrics and delicate accessories. Lace, collars, cuffs, and trims were often detached from garments before washing and laundered separately by hand. These delicate items were soaked in warm, soapy water, gently rubbed, and then dried flat to maintain their shape. Some women would use starch or sugar water to stiffen lace, giving it a crisp, polished appearance. For royal gowns, lace and trimmings might even be cleaned by specialist laundresses, who worked exclusively with fine textiles. Woolens, on the other hand, required a very different approach. Wool clothing was washed infrequently, because water and heat could easily cause it to shrink or lose its shape. Instead, it was brushed, aired, and occasionally wiped with damp cloths. When washing was unavoidable, garments were soaked in lukewarm water with mild soap, then carefully rolled and pressed rather than wrung out. The drying process involved laying the garment flat to prevent stretching or warping. These painstaking steps were necessary to preserve the longevity of wool garments, which were both expensive and essential for winter wear. Even simple cotton garments required careful handling. While cotton could withstand boiling and scrubbing, it was prone to yellowing over time. To combat this, Victorians used bluing agents made from powdered indigo or Prussian blue, which were added to rinse water to give fabrics a brighter, whiter appearance. Bluing was especially popular for bed linens, undergarments, and shirts, which were expected to look crisp and clean. The royal laundries often used bluing techniques to maintain the immaculate appearance of the Queen's personal linens and tablecloths. Ironing was the final and perhaps most critical step in the laundry process. A poorly ironed garment was considered nearly as bad as a dirty one. For fine fabrics, irons were wrapped in soft cloths to prevent scorch marks. Starched items like collars, cuffs, and petticoats required precise pressing to achieve the sharp, structured look that was fashionable at the time. In royal households, ironing was an all-day affair, with teams of servants working in shifts to ensure every garment was perfectly pressed before it was returned to the wardrobe. Laundry was also deeply connected to gender roles in Victorian society. Women, whether as housewives or laundresses, were almost always responsible for washing and maintaining clothing. A woman's skill in laundry work was considered a measure of her domestic ability. This was particularly true for working-class women, many of whom earned their living as washerwomen, taking in laundry from wealthier households. It was grueling work, often done outdoors or in poorly ventilated washhouses, with hours spent bending over steaming tubs and lifting heavy waterlogged fabrics. By the late 19th century, however, technology began to ease some of these burdens. Early laundry wringers, washboards, and hand-cranked washing machines became more common, especially in middle-class homes. Commercial laundries also expanded, offering washing and ironing services for a fee. Even so, the care and maintenance of clothing remained a time-consuming and labor-intensive task, particularly for households striving to keep up with the strict standards of Victorian cleanliness. Clothing hygiene also intersected with broader public health concerns. As germ theory gained acceptance, people began to realize that washing clothes and linens could help prevent the spread of illness. This was especially important in crowded urban areas, where outbreaks of diseases like typhoid and cholera were common. Laundries were advised to boil linens and some hospitals and wealthy households had separate facilities for disinfecting clothing and bedding. Queen Victoria's palaces, with their large staff and frequent guests, were particularly vigilant about maintaining sanitary conditions, ensuring that linens were washed, aired, and replaced regularly. Interestingly, laundry was not only a domestic duty, but also a source of pride. Freshly washed and pressed clothing was a visual symbol of order and discipline, both at home and in public. The royal family, always conscious of their image, relied on this principle. Whether it was the Queen's pristine white nightgowns, Prince Albert's impeccably pressed uniforms, or the linens displayed during state banquets, every piece reflected a meticulous standard of cleanliness and care. Reflecting on these practices, it's astonishing how much time, effort, and labor Victorians devoted to clothing hygiene. Today, with washing machines, detergents, and electric irons, we can achieve in a few hours what once required entire days of work. Yet the Victorians considered this effort essential to maintaining respectability and social order. It leaves us with a curious thought. Would the Victorians, who spent hours boiling and scenting their garments, view our modern methods as efficient but soulless? Or would they marvel at how technology has freed us from the backbreaking work that once defined the very meaning of being well?